Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was driving back from my sister's place in Byron that night, taking the farm roads like I always did because they cut the trip down by 15 minutes. It was one of those cool, dry August nights where the sky feels huge and the air smells like dirt and cut hay. I'd left later than I meant to, so it was already close to midnight when I turned onto County Road 14. That stretch had no houses for miles, just open fields and the occasional windbreak of trees. I remember lowering the radio because a weird static hiss came through, even though the station usually came in fine out there. Not loud, not alarming, just enough that I noticed. I turned the volume down to almost nothing. The quiet felt nice at first. A few minutes later, I caught something moving in my peripheral vision. I thought it was a plane at first, because around there you usually see a couple every hour heading toward the city. But when I glanced up through the windshield, there weren't any blinking lights. It was just this shape, a dark patch drifting across the stars, slow and smooth. I kept driving, trying not to overthink it. The road was straight, so I didn't have to focus too hard. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. Whatever it wasn't flying like anything I recognized. No faint roar, no hum, nothing. Just silent movement. My headlights stretched out along the empty road ahead. The fields on both sides were low and brown, so there was nothing tall enough to block the sky. I had an unobstructed view of the thing drifting above me. At first, I thought maybe it was a cloud, except the sky was totally clear. The stars were sharp and bright, the kind of sky you only get when you're far from town. And the thing wasn't shaped like a cloud anyway. Clouds spread out at the edges, soften into the sky. This silhouette was precise, smooth, a clean outline like a curved edge or slope. It crossed over a cluster of stars and they disappeared behind it. Not dimmed, fully gone. Then reappeared when the thing passed beyond them. I remember saying, "No way," but very quietly, like I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I slowed the car to maybe 30. The shape drifted almost directly overhead now. My windshield didn't give me the full view, so I opened the driver's window and leaned slightly to the left to look up at the sky. That's when the temperature in the car dropped. Not dramatically, more like somebody opened a freezer nearby. A sudden cold breeze touched my face, even though the night air outside had been mild just moments earlier. I checked the vents out of habit, but the AC was off. The car wasn't creating that cold. I pulled to the shoulder and killed the engine. Instantly, everything went still. The dark silhouette continued moving above me. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a small house from my perspective, but it was close enough that I felt weirdly exposed standing under it, like I shouldn't be directly beneath something I couldn't identify. The crickets had stopped. I didn't notice at first, but once it hit me, it felt wrong. No bugs, no wind in the grass, no distant frogs, just this dead, flat silence. The shape paused. Not completely, just enough that its movement slowed to almost nothing. It hovered over the fields, not directly above me anymore, but off to the right. I stepped out of the car without really planning to. I just wanted a clearer view. The gravel under my shoes sounded too loud in the quiet. I walked around the front of the car and shielded my eyes from the cooling engine's faint glow. The silhouette looked even darker compared to the sky now. A chunk of nothing where stars should have been. Then, and this is the part I still replay in my head, its edges softened. Not like it turned transparent, but like something about its shape loosened. The hard outline melted into the night, and the stars behind it began to show through, one by one, as if whatever was blocking them was dissolving. A soft flicker caught my eye near the ground. I looked down just in time to see my car's dashboard lights blink off, then on again, only for a second. The engine was still off, but the electronics woke up briefly on their own, then settled. The silence deepened. My ears rang faintly, like they do after a loud concert, except there hadn't been any noise. When I looked back up, the silhouette was nearly gone, just a faint distortion against the stars, the kind you only catch when you're staring directly at it. I held my breath and watched. The distortion thinned, stretched horizontally, and faded into nothing. The stars didn't twinkle or shift. They just resumed being stars. I waited for some delayed sound, a distant boom, a rumble, anything, but there was nothing. The quiet held for another few seconds before the crickets came back all at once, not gradually, like someone pressed play. I stood there until my arms started to feel cold. Then I got back in the car and turned the key. The engine hesitated, just for a split second, then started like normal. As I pulled back onto the road, I noticed the radio was dead silent. The display showed the station number, but no sound came through until I toggled it off and back on. When I did, the same static hiss appeared again, but softer. I turned it off for the rest of the drive. About 10 minutes later, I passed a lone farmhouse with a porch light on. Seeing something familiar helped settle me a bit. I checked the clock on the dashboard and frowned. I knew I'd been stopped for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, but the time showed I'd lost almost 20. I thought maybe I'd misread it earlier, but I kept checking it over and over during the drive home, and it stayed consistent. When I got back to my apartment, the electricity inside felt off. Not unstable, just a strange tension in the air, the way it feels right before a storm. I plugged my phone in and noticed it wasn't charging properly. The battery icon flickered. When I unplugged it and plugged it in again, everything was normal. I checked a map the next day to see if there were any flight routes or local aircraft reports around that area. Nothing. No weather anomalies either. The sky had been perfectly clear. I didn't tell anybody for a while. I didn't want to sound like I was making something out of nothing. But I know what I saw. Or at least, what I didn't see. That patch of sky carved out like a missing piece, drifting in silence above the fields. The part that sticks with me most isn't the silhouette itself. It's the way the world reacted around it. The cold air, the dead quiet, the electronics flickering like they were being tested, and how everything went right back to normal the second it faded, as if whatever had passed through didn't want to leave a trace. I woke up at 3:08 a.m. because my phone lit up on the nightstand. It wasn't a notification or an alarm. The screen just turned on. At first I thought I'd nudged it in my sleep, but when I picked it up, the camera app was open. Front-facing camera. Recording mode. I didn't hit record. I'm sure of that. The room looked normal through the screen, just dark and grainy. I closed the app and checked the time again. 3:08. I remember thinking how wide awake I suddenly felt, like someone had shaken me out of sleep. The house was silent. No traffic outside, no heater running, nothing. When I opened the Photos app, there was one new image timestamped just a minute earlier. I didn't remember taking anything, but I tapped it anyway. The whole picture was dark except for this pale blur up in the corner near the ceiling. It wasn't a face or a shape I could identify, just a smear of faint white, like a reflection or a fog patch. My ceiling is flat, eggshell paint, nothing shiny. I tried to recreate it with the camera, waving it around in the dark, taking pictures at different angles. Nothing came close. That was the first moment I felt that tight, cold awareness in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something close. I got up and switched on the lamp. The room looked completely normal. No weird shadows, no insects, no drafts. I checked the ceiling carefully. Corners, vents, smoke alarm. Nothing out of place. I even stood on a chair to run my hand across the paint. It felt the same as always. I should have gone back to bed, but I couldn't. I walked into the hallway, then into the living room, just trying to shake off the uneasiness. I opened the blinds a little and saw my street empty. No cars, no people. The same dim orange streetlights as always. But when I walked past the thermostat on my way back, I noticed it said the house temperature was 74 degrees. I keep it at 68 at night. I put my hand against the wall. It was warm, like someone had turned the heat way up and then shut it off a minute ago. The air itself didn't feel hot anymore, but the surfaces did. Only slightly, but enough to notice. That unsettled me more than the picture. I checked the HVAC app on my phone. No recent activity. According to the system, the heat hadn't run for hours. By then I wasn't tired at all. I turned every light on in the house, something I never do at night, and walked room to room, checking windows, checking locks. I didn't see anything unusual, but the whole place felt wrong in this subtle, quiet way. like the atmosphere wasn't exactly lining up with what I was seeing. When I finally went back to my bedroom, I realized the phone camera had opened again. It was sitting exactly where I'd left it, face down on the blanket, but the camera was active. Not recording this time, just open. I hadn't touched it since walking out of the room. There were no calls or notifications, no apps running in the background that would trigger it. I felt this deep instinct to check the new photo again. Maybe the blur had been something obvious I just hadn't recognized at first. So I opened the gallery. There was a second picture. This one was brighter, like the flash had gone off, except the flash was disabled. I never use it. The image was the corner of the room again, the same ceiling area, but now the pale blur was lower, maybe a foot from where it had been before. Still shapeless, still impossible to describe. Just a whitish smear, like light that didn't belong. I looked up at the actual ceiling. Nothing, just empty space. Something about the angle in the photo didn't feel right. The phone would have needed to be pointing upward from near the floor to capture that view. I certainly didn't take it, and even if I had sleepwalked or something, the flash wasn't on. The brightness didn't make sense. I checked the metadata. My phone said the camera shutter speed was 1/20. That's low light compensation. So the room had been dim when the photo was taken, yet the picture looked brighter than that, like it had its own light source. I set the phone down very slowly after that and stepped back from the bed. My heart rate was picking up, and I kept looking at the doorway like something might appear there at any second. I didn't want to leave the room again, but I also didn't want to be inside it. I ended up standing halfway in the hall, halfway out, trying to figure out what to do. Around then, the house made this soft clicking sound, not from the walls settling, not from the vents. It sounded mechanical, small, like a switch flipping. It came from the opposite end of the hallway near the laundry room. I held my breath and listened. Nothing followed it. No footsteps, no shifting, no humming. Just that single click that didn't fit with anything in the house. I checked every appliance. Washer, dryer, water heater, breaker box. Everything was fine. Everything idle. The breaker handles were all in their normal positions. I hadn't lost power. Nothing had tripped. I walked back toward the bedroom and paused in the doorway. My phone screen was lit again. Camera app. I didn't pick it up. I didn't want to touch it at all. I just leaned over slowly and peered at the screen. The camera view was facing upward again, pointed straight at the ceiling. But the live feed looked totally normal. Just the smooth white paint, the vent, the corner seam. No blur, no movement, no shadows. I closed the app. Then, out of curiosity or fear or something in between, I opened the gallery again. A third photo had appeared. This one was almost completely dark, except for a faint glow in the upper left, barely visible unless I tilted the phone. It didn't look like a reflection or a light leak. It looked like something softly illuminated from inside the darkness itself. Not bright enough to cast shadows, just enough to be seen. There was no shape to it, no outline, but the glow had a direction to it, like it was facing toward something, or away from something. I lowered the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I felt exposed in a way I can't explain, like the room wasn't empty, even though my eyes said it was. It wasn't terror, exactly. It was more like I was being observed from a place I couldn't pinpoint. After a few minutes, I forced myself to turn every light off again. It felt wrong to keep them on, like it made things more obvious somehow. I lay back down, not expecting to sleep, phone face down beside me. I didn't close my eyes for a long time. At some point, maybe around 5, I drifted off. When I woke up again, sunlight was coming through the blinds. The phone was still on the bed where I'd left it. No new apps open, no new photos. The house temperature was normal. The walls felt cool again. The pictures were still there, though. 3 of them. All time stamped within 5 minutes of each other. All showing something I can't explain and don't really want to. I haven't deleted them, but I also haven't looked at them again. I moved the phone charger to the living room, so the phone stays out there overnight now. And I haven't woken up at 3:08 since. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed waiting to fall asleep, I swear I can sense something in the upper corners of the room, like the air is thicker there. Not enough to see, just enough that I know it's different. I haven't taken another picture, and I won't. I was driving back from my friend Marcus's place in Brookville, taking the long county road that cuts through a bunch of farmland before it loops toward my neighborhood. It was close to midnight on a Thursday, late enough that the road was completely empty. No cars behind me, none coming the other way. Just the steady hum of my old Civic and the kind of darkness you only get outside town. It had rained earlier, so the asphalt still had that dull shine to it. The air looked clean in my headlights, little bits of mist drifting low to the ground. I wasn't tired exactly, just zoned out from hanging out too long, listening to old music, not really thinking about anything. I remember glancing at the clock, 11:47 p.m. I wasn't far from the long straight section that runs past the abandoned grain elevator. I'd driven that road 100 times. I know every sign, every turn, every weird dip in the pavement. So when the brightening happened, I noticed instantly. The entire road ahead of me lit up. Not like high beams from an oncoming car. The light didn't come from the front or the sides. It came from above, but not in a normal way. There were no shadows. Everything just brightened. Like some huge soft spotlight had been switched on, washing the road, the fields, the fence posts, even the tops of the trees in this pale, almost white light. I slowed down without meaning to. It wasn't blinding, just unnatural. Too even. Too clean. My first stupid thought was that maybe a helicopter was overhead, but there was no noise. Not even wind displacement, just silence and brightness. It lasted maybe 4 or 5 seconds. Long enough for me to lose my momentum and start to pull toward the shoulder because I couldn't match what I was seeing with anything that made sense. Then it faded, not abruptly, but evenly, like someone turning down a dimmer switch. It dimmed until it was gone, and suddenly it was just my headlights again cutting a narrow path through the dark. I sat there gripping the wheel, trying to figure out what I'd actually seen. The road looked normal. The fields were dark again. Nothing seemed disturbed. Then I noticed where I was. Somehow I was already past the grain elevator, maybe half a mile past it, even though I didn't remember driving that stretch. I would have passed a faded white billboard and a broken road reflector I always use as a marker, but I hadn't seen either one. It was like the bright stretch had covered that entire distance, and I'd moved through it without noticing the travel. I checked my speedometer, 30 miles per hour, slower than I'd been going before the light. I checked the clock, 11:53. 6 minutes had passed since I last looked at the time, and I should have only needed 2 or 3 to reach that point. I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do. The road felt wrong, though, not physically, just in the way my brain was processing it. I couldn't shake the idea that I'd jumped forward somehow. I kept checking the mirrors like something might appear behind me, even though everything stayed pitch black. A few minutes later, my radio fizzed. Not full static, more like it lost its signal for half a second and came back. It's an old car, so I didn't think much of it until it happened again. Then again, each time in the same pulsing interval. I turned it off and drove in silence. The fields on either side of the road looked darker than usual. I don't know how else to put it. Just darker. Like the light from my headlights wasn't traveling as far as it normally did. Maybe that was just me being on edge, but I kept feeling like the darkness itself was closer to the car. I rolled the window down to let in some air and try to clear my head. The night was dead quiet. Normally out there you can hear insects, frogs, the occasional cow in the distance. That night it felt like someone had switched off the whole soundscape. Just the wind from the car and nothing else. When I reached the old iron bridge, I slowed down again. That's another landmark I know by heart. The bridge always rattles a little when you drive over it, always. But that night, the tires made almost no sound. It was like the whole structure had turned solid or heavy. Halfway across, the air pressure shifted. It wasn't dramatic, more like the feeling you get in your ears when you're driving up a mountain. A tiny pop I felt more than heard. The hairs on my arms stood up. I leaned forward, trying to see if something was above the car, but the sky was empty. No clouds, no planes, no lights. I sped up after that. Every time I passed under a tree branch, the shadows felt delayed, like the light from my headlights was taking a fraction of a second longer to register. It was so subtle I kept second-guessing myself, but it kept happening. My brain kept noticing it. When I reached the final turn before my neighborhood, the air shifted again. Not the same pressure change. This time it warmed up suddenly, like someone had aimed a space heater at the windshield. It lasted maybe a single second. Then everything was normal again. I pulled into my driveway faster than I should have. I sat there with the engine running, watching the road behind me, expecting something to show in the distance. Nothing did. Inside the house, the microwave clock was blinking. So was the stove. Both of them. Like there had been a brief outage. But the porch light was still on, and the digital thermostat hadn't reset, so it wasn't a full power failure. I walked through the whole house turning on lights, even though I usually don't. Something about the silence in each room made my chest feel tight. I kept checking the windows before bed, especially the one facing the road. When I finally lay down, I replayed the whole drive in my head. Every detail. The brightness, the silence, the missing stretch of road, the time jump that didn't make sense. None of it fit together. There wasn't a moment where I blacked out. I didn't feel tired or distracted. I remembered everything except the part I should have been driving through. The weirdest thing, though, the part that keeps coming back, is how normal it all felt while it was happening. Not safe or calm, but strangely expected. Like some part of me recognized the brightness even though I knew I'd never seen anything like it. The next morning, when I drove the same route in daylight, everything looked completely ordinary. All the signs were there. The grain elevator, the billboard, the reflector. I even timed the drive from Marcus's place to my house. It lined up exactly with how long it usually takes. The only thing that didn't make sense was the gap I couldn't account for, and the stretch of road that felt like it had been lit up just for me. I first noticed the glow because of how still the room felt. I'd gone to bed around midnight. Nothing unusual about the day. I'd spent most of it helping my sister move boxes into her new apartment on the other side of town, so by the time I got home, I was worn out. I didn't even bother watching anything or checking my phone much. I just showered, turned off the lights, and collapsed into bed around 12. It must have been close to 1 when I woke up again. No sound woke me. At least, not any sound I recognized. I just opened my eyes and felt like something was different. It wasn't a dream, or if it was, the dream was gone already. The room looked normal, but I could tell right away the lighting was wrong. My blinds were shut, but around the edges there was this faint white glow bleeding in. Not bright, not enough to light the room, just enough that I could see the outline of my dresser and the edge of my door without my eyes having to adjust. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor had motion lights turn on, which happens sometimes when raccoons wander through the alley. But this was softer and steadier than that. No flicker, no shifting, just a pale, even glow. I got up, kind of expecting to see headlights from a passing car sweeping through the window. Instead, the glow stayed exactly the same. I hesitated before opening the blinds because something about the light felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. It made me nervous in a way that didn't match what I was actually seeing. When I finally pulled the blinds back, the yard outside was completely dark. Pitch black. No floodlights on, no neighbor lights reflecting off anything. Nothing. It should have been darker inside my room because of that, but somehow the glow persisted. What threw me off the most was the sky. It wasn't bright exactly, but it looked washed out like somebody had turned down the contrast. Normally I see stars from my backyard. Not a ton, but enough. That night the sky looked empty. Not cloudy, not foggy, just pale and flat and wrong, like the color of an old TV screen before an image appears. I stood there for a good minute trying to figure out if I was still half asleep or if maybe my eyes were adjusting weird. I even closed them and opened them again, but the washed out sky was the same. I checked the house after that. I don't usually wander around in the middle of the night, but I felt uneasy standing still. The hallway was dark except for that faint glow coming from my room. And when I got to the kitchen, I noticed the digital clock on the microwave blinking. The stove clock, too. Not off, blinking 12, like there'd been a power flicker. But my alarm clock in the bedroom hadn't reset. Outside the kitchen window, everything looked normal. Street was dark, no lights, no movement. The sky was paler there too, but not as obvious as from my bedroom. It was like the angle mattered, which didn't make sense. Sky is sky. I went back to my room and looked out again. Still washed out. Still empty. I checked the weather on my phone, like maybe some weird type of fog could explain it, even though I knew that wasn't right. The forecast said clear skies, cool temperature, nothing unusual. I held my phone up toward the window to take a picture, but the glow faded a little as soon as I lifted it. Not completely, just softened, like whatever was causing it didn't want to be looked at too directly. I lowered my phone and waited. After a few seconds, the glow strengthened again, back to that faint but steady brightness. It wasn't reacting to me exactly, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was aware somehow, like the timing was too coincidental. I cracked the window open a little to listen. I expected to hear at least crickets or a dog barking somewhere, but the outside was silent. Completely silent. No wind. No insects. No distant cars. A kind of silence that felt thick, like the air was holding its breath. The temperature coming through the window felt a few degrees warmer than it should have. Not warm like summertime, just warm enough that I noticed. Almost like something had heated the air just above the house. I stepped back, figuring maybe I should just close the blinds and try to go back to sleep, but the glow pulsing against the walls made that impossible. I kept watching the sky, expecting it to darken again or maybe brighten more, but it stayed in that strange, washed-out state, not changing, not moving. Then something did shift, but so subtly that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A small patch of the sky looked slightly darker for a second, like something passed in front of whatever was causing the pale light. It wasn't shaped like anything I could describe. Not a cloud, not a bird, not a plane, just a smooth, softer patch. It drifted across maybe a few degrees of the sky, and then blended back into the same washed-out tone, leaving no border. That was the moment my chest tightened, because the motion was too slow and too controlled to be natural. I stood there gripping the windowsill, watching the spot where it had moved, feeling the hair on my arms go up. I kept waiting to see it again, but nothing else moved. I thought about waking my roommate, but the idea of explaining any of this felt ridiculous. I wasn't sure I understood it myself, and part of me didn't want to test whether someone else could see it. If they couldn't, I'd lose whatever grip on reality I still had. The glow stayed for at least another 10 minutes. It didn't brighten or fade, just hovered at the same level, filling my room with the faintest white tint. I noticed my phone screen looked slightly dimmer than usual when I checked the time, like the ambient light was interfering in a way I couldn't explain. My phone compass kept drifting too, moving a few degrees every few seconds even though I held the phone still. Eventually, slowly, the glow thinned. It didn't blink out, it just dissolved, like fog burning away after sunrise, except it was the middle of the night. The sky outside regained its normal darkness. The stars popped back into place and the yard remained quiet. I closed the blinds, but I didn't go back to sleep right away. For a long time, I sat in bed listening for anything. A hum, a vibration, a shift in the air pressure, anything at all that might tell me the glow was returning. But the house stayed still. The silence faded back into the normal nighttime background sounds. Somewhere down the street, a dog finally barked. In the morning, nothing looked unusual. The clock still blinked, but that was it. My roommate hadn't noticed anything. The sky was clear. I went outside before leaving for work and checked the yard, though I'm not sure what I was expecting to find. There was nothing. But sometimes now, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I check the blinds before I even think about checking the time. I can't help it. I keep waiting to see that washed out sky again, even though I still don't know what it meant or what was behind it. I was out on Lake Wister late that night because I'd had one of those days where sitting inside made me feel restless. My buddy Evan had let me borrow his old aluminum rowboat for the week. Nothing fancy, just a squeaky little thing with oars that always felt slightly uneven. I'd taken it out plenty of times before, usually right around sunset, but this was the first time I'd gone out past 11. The weather was calm, clear sky, barely any breeze, the kind of night where sound carries across the water. I could hear frogs from the marshy side of the lake, and the occasional plunk of a fish hitting the surface somewhere in the dark. I wasn't fishing. I'd brought a rod but never used it. I just wanted the quiet. I drifted farther out than usual, letting the water take me wherever it wanted. The shoreline lights from the cabins on the west side were weak and scattered, hardly bright enough to reflect. Most people had already turned in for the night. Mine was the only boat on the lake as far as I could tell. I remember checking my phone and seeing it was 11:43 p.m. The battery was at 42%. I put it away and leaned back, letting the boat rock on its own. A bat flew overhead, quick and silent, and then the soundscape settled again. The first strange thing was how the water stopped moving. I didn't notice it right away. It happened gradually, like the waves were shrinking without wind. At first, I thought maybe the boat had drifted into a more sheltered part of the lake, but that didn't make sense. I'd been out near the middle, where it's usually the choppiest. I dipped my fingers over the side and felt nothing. No ripples, no current. Not even the tiny lapping waves that should have been bumping against the hull. The lake was flat. Perfectly flat. Like glass. I sat up and listened, trying to figure out if something had changed in the environment. But everything sounded normal. Crickets, frogs, a distant dog bark from somewhere on the east side. The silence wasn't the dramatic kind. It was more like the water had decided to pause. I looked over the edges of the boat. The reflections were too sharp. The stars looked like pinpricks in the surface. Even the hazy glow of a porch light miles off held its shape without distortion. I'd never seen the lake that still, not even early in the morning before sunrise. I told myself it was weird, but not impossible. Weather does strange things sometimes. But then the second thing happened. A faint light appeared beneath the water. At first, I thought it was my eyes adjusting weirdly to the darkness. It looked like a small, pale spot, maybe 6 or 7 feet below the surface. The water was deep where I was, so I shouldn't have been able to see anything down there at all, but the light was just bright enough to stand out. It didn't flicker like a fish or shift like a reflection. It was steady. I leaned forward, bracing myself against the side of the boat. The light grew a little stronger, enough to tint the water around it in a faint milky color. I could see the edges of it, a soft circle, maybe the size of a basketball. Then it started to move, not upward, not spreading, just sliding horizontally in a perfectly straight line. No wobble, no drifting, no disturbance in the water. It was like it was following a track. The lake remained flat the entire time, as if whatever was down there wasn't pushing any water aside. I tried to follow it with the boat, but the oars just clunked uselessly against the surface. The moment I dipped them in, I noticed something else. There was no resistance. It felt like stirring air. The water didn't move around the oar blades. No ripples formed. It was like the whole surface had turned into a sheet. The light continued moving, straight as an arrow, maybe 20 or 30 feet from where it started. Then it slowed. Not suddenly, gradually, like someone turning a dimmer switch in reverse. I felt my breathing get shallow. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was close. I wanted to call someone, but I knew how it would sound. And anyway, the moment I reached for my phone, the screen froze. Completely frozen. The numbers on the clock didn't change. The battery icon didn't shift. Touch didn't register. I kept staring at the phone like that would force it to work again. Nothing. When I looked back into the water, the light had faded almost completely. Just a softer, distant glow like the last ember of a fire. Then that disappeared too. The water didn't immediately return to normal. It stayed still for maybe another minute. Maybe longer. I don't know. Time felt wrong. My phone still wouldn't respond. Then, like someone flipping a switch, the lake woke up again. A small wave slapped against the side of the boat. Then another. The frogs sounded louder, like they'd been cut out and pasted back in. The breeze picked up and tugged at the shirt on my shoulders. A fish jumped somewhere off to my right, sending rings across the surface, and my phone unfroze. The time read 12:21 a.m. That didn't match what I remembered, but I couldn't trust my sense of time by then. Maybe I'd zoned out longer than it felt like. I rowed back immediately. This time, the water behaved normally, oars catching and pulling like they should. By the time I reached the dock, the whole experience already felt impossible, like something I'd imagined. But the moment I stood on shore, I felt my legs shaking so badly, I had to sit for a minute before climbing the path to the cabin. Inside, everything looked exactly how I'd left it. I checked the clock on the microwave. It read 12:26. All the power was fine. The lights didn't flicker. There was nothing to prove anything strange had happened. I locked the door anyway. I didn't sleep much. Something about the stillness of the lake kept replaying in my mind. Not the light, though that was strange enough on its own, but the way the water had stopped, like it was holding itself in place, like it was listening. The next morning, I went down to the dock again just to see the lake in the daylight. It looked perfectly normal, windy even, ripples everywhere. A couple of people were already out fishing, and from the way they were talking to each other, nothing unusual had happened to them overnight. Before I returned the boat to Evan, I checked underneath it, half expecting to see scorch marks or slime or something. Of course, there was nothing. I haven't taken the boat back out at night since then. I still go to the lake sometimes, but only during the day. Even then, I catch myself watching the water too closely, waiting for it to pause again. But it never does, at least not while I'm looking. I was lying on my back in the gravel turnout behind my apartment complex, the spot where the streetlights didn't quite reach. I went out there sometimes after work to clear my head. It wasn't exactly nature, but you could see a decent patch of sky over the tree line if the clouds stayed away. That night was cold and dry, just after a front had moved through. The air felt clean in that way. It only does right after the weather changes. I remember I was scrolling through a text thread with my coworker Mina when I looked up and noticed a star that seemed a little brighter than usual. Nothing strange at first, it was just sitting there, the way stars do. Then it dimmed slightly, then brightened again. Not flashing, not twinkling, more like a heartbeat. A soft, steady pulse. I lowered my phone and stared at it. The rhythm was almost perfect. Bright, dim, like it was following a metronome. At first, I thought maybe I'd blinked weirdly or my eyes were adjusting, but it kept going. I even covered one eye, then the other, just to be sure it wasn't something with my vision. It was still pulsing. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds before I thought to record it. I switched the phone to video, pointed it up, and as soon as the camera loaded, the star stopped. Just froze at one brightness. No variation. I dropped the phone to my lap and looked again with my eyes. Nothing, just a regular point of light. I even said out loud, "Okay, come on," like it was a joke. A minute later, it dimmed sharply, not pulsing this time, and stayed faint. I tried to track other stars near it, thinking maybe clouds were coming in, but the sky was totally clear. Every other star stayed the same brightness it had been. I kept waiting for it to pulse again, but that single star just sat there, faint and steady. I should have gone inside then, but something about the whole thing felt like a half-finished sentence. So I stayed. I put the phone away, lay back down, and tried to just watch the sky the way I had before. A few minutes passed. Then I noticed something odd with the stars around that same area. Not the pulsing one, the ones next to it. Very slight motion, like maybe the edges were blurring. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was getting tired, but when I blinked, the blur sharpened into this tiny shift, like the stars had nudged closer together. Not by much, barely anything, but I knew the sky didn't do that. I sat up slowly. There was no sound, no breeze, nothing to distract from it. I watched that patch for a long time. The stars didn't move again. They looked normal. Still, something about their spacing felt off, like a picture that had been erased and redrawn just slightly wrong. I kept checking my phone clock without meaning to. It went from 10:41 to 10:54 in what felt like a blink. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I just suddenly realized I couldn't remember the moments between those minutes. I didn't feel dizzy or confused, just out of sync, like I'd skipped forward in a conversation I wasn't aware I was having. I stood up to leave. As I dusted gravel off my jacket, a soft clicking sound came from the woods behind the complex. It wasn't an animal noise, not leaves or sticks. It was mechanical, sharp, sparse, like something adjusting. I froze and listened. Another click, a longer pause, then two more, spaced evenly. I backed toward the parking lot, keeping my eyes on the trees. The sky above me felt too quiet, not silent, just holding its breath. When I reached the sidewalk, I turned once more to look at the pulsing star. It was bright again, not pulsing, just brighter than anything else in that part of the sky. I stood there and watched it hold that brightness for a full minute. Then I slowly brought the phone up again, not even switching to video yet, just pointing the camera toward it. Instantly, the star dimmed, not flickered, not faded. It shut down to almost nothing, like someone flipping a switch. I lowered the phone. It brightened. I raised the phone. It dimmed. I repeated this 3 times, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe my screen brightness was messing with my eyes, or my angle was shifting, but the change was too direct, too immediate. Phone up, dim star. Phone down, bright star. By the 4th time, my hands were shaking. Not violently, but enough that I couldn't keep the phone steady. I put it away. When I finally turned toward my apartment building, I noticed the security lights along the walkway flickering. Not all at once, one after another, a soft ripple of dimming from one end of the complex to the other. Nobody else was outside, no windows lit up. The whole place felt disconnected from the rest of the world. I walked faster. Right before I reached my stairs, I felt a pressure in my ears, the kind you get in a plane during descent. It built gradually, then released with a faint pop. I turned around. Just once, the bright star was gone. Not dim, not hidden behind clouds. Gone. The sky looked normal except for that one missing point. Even if I hadn't been fixated on it earlier, I would have noticed that hole in the pattern. Inside the apartment, everything felt strangely warm. I checked the thermostat, normal. I walked into the kitchen to get water, and the digital clock on the microwave read 12:02 a.m. That couldn't be right. I'd only been outside maybe 30 minutes. My phone said 11:23. The microwave clock had reset itself. That usually only happened after a power outage, but the clocks on my stove, my router, and my bedroom alarm were all unchanged. Just the microwave. I didn't sleep right away. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually I drifted off. In the morning, I checked the sky again. Everything looked normal. The star patterns were what they should have been. The microwave clock was still off by 40 minutes. I went to work, told no one, acted normal. But that night, when I went back out to the gravel turnout, I couldn't shake the sense that the sky looked unfamiliar in some small, impossible way. Like one part of it remembered me. I haven't tried to record anything since. I still stargaze sometimes, but I leave my phone in my pocket. I just watch. And every so often, I catch myself checking that same patch of sky, waiting for the faint pulse that I don't really want to see again. I noticed the light before I noticed anything else. It was late, close to 11, and I was taking my usual loop around my neighborhood in Bloomington to get some air before bed. The sky was overcast, that dull orange-gray you get from the streetlights reflecting off clouds. Nothing about the night felt strange at first, just warm, quiet, a little humid. I was halfway down Larkspur Drive when I saw it, a dim white light hanging above a rooftop maybe 4 houses ahead of me on the right. At first, I thought it was someone's security light, or maybe a drone somebody was messing around with. But it didn't move at all. It just hovered there, maybe 20 feet above the shingles. Too low for a plane, too steady for anything handheld. I stopped walking without thinking. The houses around me were dark, except for a couple of porch lights. The one with the light above it was completely dark. No TV glow, no inside lamps, nothing. The street itself was dead quiet. No cars, no dogs, just that soft hum you get from the intersection a block over. The light didn't flicker. It didn't sway. It just held its place like it was pinned to the air. I kept staring at it, trying to make sense of the distance. It wasn't bright enough to be a helicopter's spotlight or anything like that. It didn't cast any noticeable beam down onto the roof. It was more like a dull, solid orb, the size of a softball maybe, glowing but contained. Almost like it didn't light up the air around it, only itself. I walked a little farther, slowly, because something in me didn't want to get closer too fast. I couldn't hear anything from it, no buzzing, no motor, no sound at all. If it had been a drone, I would have heard the rotors from that distance, especially at night. But the air was still. When I moved closer, the light didn't respond. It didn't shift or blink or get brighter. It was unnerving how steady it was. The houses on that street sit pretty close to one another, maybe 20 feet between them. The light hovered right over the ridge of the roof, exactly centered, like whatever it was had chosen the spot deliberately. When I reached the house across the street from it, I stopped again. I felt hesitant. I guess, but not scared yet. More confused than anything. I glanced around to see if anyone else was outside. No movement in windows, no cars passing, nothing. The whole street felt paused. The light finally changed right as I opened my mouth to call out, though I don't know who I thought I'd be calling to. It didn't flicker or fade, it just started rising. Smooth and perfectly vertical. No acceleration, just moving like it had been attached to an invisible string being pulled upward. I followed it with my eyes as it climbed above the roofline, then above the big maple tree in the yard next door, then above the streetlights. It didn't blink or wobble, it didn't get brighter or dimmer. It stayed the same muted white glow as it went up. It disappeared so abruptly I didn't register the moment it vanished. 1 second it was there, halfway up the cloud cover. The next, the spot was blank like it had never been lit at all. No streak, no fade out, just gone. I kept standing there like an idiot, waiting for it to come back, but the sky looked normal again. Just that washed out nighttime orange. Something about how suddenly it vanished made my chest tighten. I started walking again, even though my legs felt shaky, like they were filled with buzzing soda water. By the time I was at the end of the block, I heard a noise behind me. Something small, like a click or a snap. It came from one of the yards across the street. I stopped. The noise didn't repeat. There was no movement, no light, nothing. But I got the weirdest urge to hurry home, like the quiet itself had turned into a warning. I walked faster. As I was turning onto my street, I noticed something else. The cicadas had stopped. They'd been loud that whole week, but now the air was dead silent. Even the distant traffic noise from the main road seemed lower, like someone had turned the city down a notch. For a moment, I wondered if there'd been some kind of power issue. The house where the light had hovered had no visible lights on, but so did plenty of other houses. People just went to bed early around here. The street lights were still on, though. Everything looked normal. But then my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, thinking maybe I had a text, but it wasn't a notification. The screen had turned white. Just a flat white rectangle. No icons, no time, nothing. I tapped it a few times and it didn't respond. I pressed the side button and the screen stayed lit. The device vibrated again, a short tremor like a heartbeat. I didn't stop walking. I didn't even slow down. I shoved the phone into my pocket and headed straight for my house. The silence felt thicker the closer I got, like the whole block was wrapped in insulation. When I reached my driveway, I had this moment where I didn't want to look up. I can't explain why. I just felt like something would be there if I checked, above the house, above the tree in the yard, above me. Not another light. Just something occupying space it shouldn't. But I did look up, and there was nothing. Just clouds. Inside, the house felt too warm, like someone had closed every vent. I turned on the kitchen light and stood there waiting for something else to glitch or blink or hum. Nothing did. The fridge kicked on, the AC finally rattled awake. The normal house sounds came back gradually, like someone releasing their hand from my ears. My phone rebooted on its own about 5 minutes later. When it came back on, the clock was wrong. Not by hours, just by a few minutes. I checked the camera roll to see if something had triggered the white screen. No new photos, no corrupted files. Everything normal. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the way the light rose. So smooth, so straight, like it didn't care about gravity at all. Nothing I've ever seen moves like that. Not balloons, not aircraft, not drones. It didn't even seem to push against the air. Over the next few days, I tried to walk the same route at the same time, hoping maybe I'd see something that would make the whole thing feel more explainable. Like a reflection or someone's weird backyard gadget or something. But the house where it hovered stayed dark every night, and nothing unusual showed up. A week later, I finally saw the family who lived there, an older couple named the Merricks, watering their flower beds. I didn't ask them anything. I thought about it, but what would I say? Hey, did you notice a floating light above your roof the other night? They'd think I was messing with them. It hasn't happened again. I still walk some nights, but I catch myself glancing at the rooftops more often than I used to. And every once in a while, when the neighborhood gets too quiet too suddenly, I feel that same pressure in my chest. Like something is hovering just out of sight, waiting for the clouds to thin. I woke up because something felt wrong with the room. Not a sound, exactly, more like a pressure that pushed me out of sleep. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the alarm clock on my nightstand blinking 12. The hallway clock was blinking too. So was the oven clock in the kitchen. Every digital thing in the house was flashing like the power had gone out, but I hadn't heard anything that would have woken me. It was maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. The house was warm the way it gets on summer nights when you forget to crack a window, but the air felt heavier, like the inside of a car right before a thunderstorm. I sat up and listened. Nothing. Not even the usual hum of the fridge. I walked to the front door because I thought maybe a transformer had blown somewhere down the block. That happens a lot where I live in Crescent Hill. Old lines, old houses, lots of trees leaning where they shouldn't. I didn't turn on any lights since they were all blinking anyway. I just opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The air outside was still and warm. It wasn't windy, wasn't raining, nothing unusual weather-wise, but right when I stepped forward, I heard this low humming far off in the distance. Low enough that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. I stood still and listened harder. I tried to figure out what direction it was coming from, but it seemed to hang in the air like it wasn't tied to anything. I thought it might be a plane, but it didn't sound like one. No rising or falling pitch, just a flat tone that didn't change. It reminded me of the vibration you get when you put your hand on an old refrigerator compressor, but stretched out across the whole neighborhood. I walked down the porch steps and onto the driveway. The humming wasn't loud, but it felt close somehow. I glanced up out of instinct, expecting maybe a weird cloud or something reflecting light. The sky was clear, just a handful of thin stars showing through the city haze. Nothing moved. The hum cut out all at once. No fade, no slow drift away, just gone. The sudden quiet was strange enough that I stayed outside waiting to hear something else. A dog barked somewhere a few streets over, like it had just snapped out of whatever held it still before. A sprinkler clicked on down the block. Everything started sounding normal again. I went back inside and checked my phone. The lock screen said 3:17 a.m., but the battery icon was stuck on the charging symbol even though it wasn't plugged in. A second later, it corrected itself. I went room to room resetting clocks so they wouldn't drive me crazy later, and I noticed the microwave display flicker once when I set the time. Just once, like it was recalibrating. I should have gone back to bed. But something felt unfinished. I couldn't shake the sense that I'd woken up in the middle of something instead of after it. I got a glass of water and stood by the back door, looking out the small window. My yard was dark, but the houses behind mine had their porch lights on, and I could see the usual shadows the fences made. Then I noticed that one of the shadows didn't look right. It wasn't shaped like anything in the yard. It wasn't tall or detailed, more of a smear, like something had blocked the light for a moment and then moved. I blinked a few times and stared at the same spot. The fence line looked normal again. The odd shape was gone. I pressed my hand to the glass and realized it felt cooler than the air inside. Not cold, just a little too cool for a summer night. Like the temperature inside the house had shifted without me noticing. I went back to the living room, sat down on the couch, and listened for the hum again. Nothing. No weird vibrations, no lights flickering, even the fridge started up again with its usual rattle. I finally tried to sleep around 5. I didn't really get much rest. My head kept replaying the hum, trying to match it to something familiar. A generator, a truck idling, an HVAC unit. But none of those fit. The sound had felt too even, too wide. If that makes sense. The next afternoon, after work, I asked my neighbor Dan if his power had gone out during the night. He said no, everything was normal at his place. I asked if he'd heard anything strange. He said, "Like what?" And I almost made something up, but then I just shrugged and said it was nothing. Back inside, I checked the breaker panel, thinking maybe something inside the house had tripped. Everything was on. I went through the clocks again. They were all fine. Nothing flickered. Nothing reset. I tried to write it off, but little things kept sticking out to me for the rest of the week. My phone glitched twice, opened the settings menu on its own, froze for a second during a call. My porch light flickered when I came home one night, only once, and didn't do it again. Stuff that could easily be explained, but the timing bothered me. 2 nights after the humming, I woke up again, not from any noise, but from the same pressure feeling as before. That heaviness in the air. I checked the clocks immediately. They were fine. Nothing was blinking. But when I stepped onto the porch, the night was completely still again. No wind, no insects, not even traffic from the highway a mile away. The quiet was thick enough that I froze halfway down the steps. I didn't hear the hum this time, but the silence had weight to it, like it was waiting for something. I stayed out there for a minute, maybe two. Then the sprinkler down the block clicked on again, the same way it had the first night, like the world was resuming from a pause. I went back inside and stood in the hallway where I could see the bedroom clock. Completely normal. Steady. Nothing wrong. But that feeling, the sense of something hovering just outside of what I could pick up, stayed with me. Not a presence, not anything supernatural, just the idea that something had been moving through the area and I happened to wake up at the wrong moment. I still don't know what the hum was. It hasn't come back in the same way since. But every now and then, usually in the early morning, I swear I feel the house go quiet for a second too long, like the air is waiting for something to pass by again. The static hit all at once. 1 second, I was listening to some late-night call-in show, and the next, the radio cut out and turned into this flat, steady tone that felt like it was coming from inside my skull more than the speakers. Not loud, just constant, like a test signal that wouldn't end. I thought the radio had finally given out, since the old Subaru I drove back then had electrical issues all the time. It was close to midnight, early fall, and I was taking County Road 17 back to my place outside Martin's Hollow. That whole stretch is nothing but fields and the occasional barn light way off in the distance. Clear sky, cold air, and that kind of quiet that feels almost staged. I had the heater on low and a half-finished gas station coffee in the cup holder. Everything felt normal until the radio dropped out. At first, I tried switching stations. AM, FM, didn't matter. Same steady tone, no fuzz, no variation. Just this single, low frequency that didn't match any static I'd ever heard before. It didn't waver when I turned the volume knob either. It didn't get louder or softer. It stayed exactly the same, like the radio wasn't controlling it anymore. While I was messing with the buttons, I caught something in the rearview mirror, just a faint white dot high above the road behind me. At first, I figured it was a plane, but it didn't blink or move. It just hovered back there, far enough that I couldn't guess the distance, but bright enough that it stood out from the stars. I kept driving. The tone stayed. A couple minutes passed, and I checked the mirror again. The light was still there, except now it seemed a little higher and a little closer, though it wasn't any brighter. It didn't drift left or right. It didn't bob or dip. It matched speed perfectly, like it was tethered above the car. I turned off the radio completely. Holding the power button like that would shut everything down. The display went dark, but the tone didn't stop. That made my stomach flip in a way I can't really describe. It felt wrong, like hearing a cell phone ring after you've powered it off. I clicked the radio back on out of panic more than anything, but the tone didn't change. Same exact pitch. The road curved near an old grain silo. I slowed a little, taking the bend, and I watched the mirror to see if the light kept pace. It did, sliding along the curve, staying centered behind me. I couldn't explain that. A plane wouldn't bank around a simple country road curve. A drone wouldn't hover that high or that steady, not in any model I'd ever seen. I tried to convince myself it was some weird reflection, maybe a bright star warped by the glass. Except when I tapped the rear view to adjust it, the light didn't shift the way reflections do. It stayed fixed in the same exact spot outside the car. Around the next straightaway, the tone dipped for a split second, like something was interfering with it. Not static, just a tiny drop in volume before it returned. Right when that happened, the light in the mirror flickered. Not blinking, more like it got hazy for a second, as if something passed in front of it. The air in the car felt different then. Heavy, like the pressure dropped inside the cabin. My ears didn't pop, but I felt a dull pressure in them, the same kind you get when riding an elevator that moves too fast. I cracked the window to even things out, but the pressure stayed the same, just this gentle squeeze against my head. I sped up a bit. The trees thinned out as I approached the long, open stretch toward Miller's Bridge. That's when I realized the light wasn't staying the same distance anymore. It was getting closer, inch by inch, slow enough that I could pretend I was imagining it, but not so slow that I could ignore it. I tried hitting the brakes lightly to test it. The car slowed. The light slowed. Perfectly. That's when the anxiety really hit. Not fear, not yet, just this deep instinctive discomfort, like something fundamental around me wasn't behaving the way it should. I grabbed my phone to take a photo, but the screen didn't respond when I tapped it. It wasn't frozen, it was just black, even though the battery had been at 70% earlier. I held down the side button. Nothing. No logo, no attempt to power on, no dead battery icon. Just a blank surface that might as well have been a piece of plastic. I set it down and kept both hands on the wheel. At Miller's Bridge, there's a slight dip where the road crosses a creek. I drove down into it, watching the mirror. The light followed the descent exactly, like it wasn't in the sky but attached to an invisible rig connected to the car. When I rose back up the opposite side, it rose too. Not at an angle, not like climbing, just staying overhead relative to my position. The tone in the radio finally shifted then. It climbed a little in pitch, barely noticeable but enough that it felt intentional. I turned the radio off again, even though I knew it wouldn't do anything. The persistent tone stayed unchanged behind the speakers. I don't know what I would have done if the light had dropped any lower. Maybe I would have floored it, maybe I would have pulled over and locked the doors, maybe I would have jumped out and run into the fields. But none of that happened. The light held its distance. What broke everything wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't a flash or a sudden movement, it was just a blink. For a fraction of a second, the light disappeared from the mirror. Total absence. Then it returned exactly where it had been, like a frame skipped. The tone in the radio dipped at the same moment, almost like they were tied together. I felt my eyes water from how tightly I was staring at the mirror. I didn't even blink. I just watched. 2 minutes from my turnoff, the light began drifting upward. Not fast, just rising at the same smooth pace it had followed me. The tone stayed steady the whole time. When the light reached a height where it blended with the stars, the tone finally stopped. Not faded, stopped. A clean cut to silence so sharp it made the absence feel loud. The radio snapped back to regular static, then to the station I'd been listening to before all of it started. The host was talking like nothing had happened. My phone powered on a second later, showing the lock screen like normal, except the time had jumped ahead by 12 minutes I didn't remember driving through. When I pulled into my driveway, I checked the rear view one last time before shutting off the car. Just the night sky. Just stars. I sat there a long time before going inside, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Nothing did. The next morning, the radio worked fine. My phone was fine. Everything looked normal. But every now and then, when I'm driving late and the road gets quiet in that same way, I'll find myself checking the mirror without meaning to, half expecting to see that faint white dot pacing along behind me, waiting for something only it understands. I noticed the shimmer before anything else. I was about 6 miles into a solo hike on the Pine Ridge Trail near Big Sur sometime in late February, when the mornings were still sharp and cold. The sun was out, but the air had that bite to it, the kind that makes your breath feel heavier than usual. I remember checking my watch earlier and it said 44 degrees, which lined up with how numb my fingers were getting. The trail curved along a slope with a bunch of switchbacks. I was alone except for a couple of hikers I'd passed an hour earlier going the opposite direction. Nothing strange about the morning besides how quiet it was. Even the birds sounded muted. I chalked that up to the cold. About halfway up one of the longer climbs, I saw what looked like heat rising from the ground, that wavy, watery distortion you see above asphalt in summer. Only this wasn't summer, and this wasn't a road. This was a cold dirt trail lined with pine needles, shaded by trees on both sides. I stopped walking. The shimmer was maybe 30 or 40 feet ahead of me, hovering just above the ground and stretching about as wide as the trail. It didn't glow or make anything brighter around it. It just warped the view behind it, bending the branches and trunks like I was looking through glass that didn't want to stay still. My first thought was that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked a few times. The distortion stayed where it was. It wasn't blowing in the wind either. It held its shape for a good 10 seconds straight. I took a couple slow steps forward. The distortion didn't react, but it shifted, almost like it slid a few feet to the right without actually moving through space. It just appeared slightly off-center from where it had been. Same shape, same waviness, just relocated. Not gradually, not floating. More like skipping frames in a video. One moment here, next moment there. That was the first moment I felt uneasy. I crouched down, thinking maybe warm air was leaking from somewhere, like a geothermal vent or some kind of natural updraft. But there was no warmth on my face, no temperature change at all. The air was cold and steady, my breath fogged normally. Nothing about the environment made sense with what I was seeing. I stood back up and looked around, hoping someone else might be on the trail to confirm I hadn't lost it. No one was coming. No rustling in the distance, no footsteps, no voices. When I looked back at the distortion, it was gone. Just the trail again. Pine needles, dirt, rocks, everything crisp and still. I stayed there another minute, half expecting it to blink back into existence. Nothing happened. I almost turned around, but I told myself I was probably just tired or dehydrated. The sun was climbing now, hitting the higher branches, and the warmth was starting to creep into the air. Maybe the combination of light and cold had done something weird to my vision. I kept hiking, but the quiet didn't feel normal anymore. Not heavy or threatening, just wrong. Even the crunch of the dirt under my boots felt too soft, like sound was being soaked up by the trees instead of bouncing back at me. About 20 minutes later, I got to a clearing where the trail bent along the ridge. That's when the second strange thing happened. I felt a shift in pressure, like the air thickened for a second. Not painful, not like altitude sickness, more like the sensation of being underwater for just a moment. My ears didn't pop, but they tingled, and I felt this faint thrum in my chest, the kind you get standing too close to a big subwoofer. I looked up automatically. The air above the clearing shimmered. Same distortion as before, but larger, stretching maybe 20 feet wide and closer to my eye level. The backdrop of trees behind it wavered like they were underwater. I stood completely still. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe because nothing about it looked solid or dangerous. It felt more like witnessing something I wasn't supposed to see. The distortion pulsed once, not brighter, just deeper, like the warping thickened for half a second. Then it shifted again. Same sudden jump as before, like skipping frames. One moment in the center of the clearing, next moment slightly farther upslope. No trail of movement, no transition. Then it faded. This time slowly dissolving until the trees behind it came back into sharp focus. I backed up a step, then another. A branch snapped somewhere behind me, just a small sound, but in that silence it felt sharp enough to cut through the air. I turned fast, expecting an animal or another hiker, but nothing was on the trail. The sound had come from below, near a cluster of bushes. I waited. Nothing moved. I didn't see the shimmer again after that, but the feeling that I wasn't alone stuck with me for the rest of the climb. Every time the wind shifted or a pine cone dropped, I felt my stomach jump. I reached the lookout point around noon. It was bright, the ocean stretched out below the cliffs, waves glinting in the sunlight. I ate a granola bar and tried to convince myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Lack of sleep, maybe, or light refraction from the cold air. But then I checked my phone. I hadn't taken it out since I started the hike. It had been at 92% battery when I left the parking lot. Now it said 31%. No apps open, no photos taken, no GPS active. I turned it off and slipped it back into my pack. The pressure in my chest had finally faded, but the quiet hadn't. Not until I started heading back down an hour later. On the descent, the sounds returned in pieces. First the wind, then the distant ocean, then birdsong, faint at first, then normal. It was like the world was slowly unmuting itself. I didn't see the shimmer again. I didn't hear any strange pressure shifts. The trail looked ordinary, almost boring compared to earlier. Back at the parking lot, a group of hikers were loading their gear into a Subaru. One of them, a guy in his 30s with a red jacket, asked if I'd had a good hike. I said yeah, just a normal day, even though I knew that wasn't true. Driving home, I kept replaying the moment the distortion jumped sideways. The suddenness of it, the silent shift. I'd never seen anything in nature move like that. Not air, not heat, not animals, nothing. I didn't tell anyone when I got home, not even my friend Marcus, who usually eats up weird stories. I figured saying it out loud would make it sound even less believable. Sometimes, when I'm outside early in the morning and the air is colder than the ground, I catch myself watching for that shimmer again. Not hoping for it, not dreading it. Just prepared, I guess. Wondering if maybe whatever it was hadn't gone away so much as stepped somewhere I couldn't see. And maybe, every now and then, it steps back. I was sitting on the porch that night, mostly just to cool off. It was one of those late August evenings where the air didn't move at all, and the humidity felt like it wrapped around you no matter what you did. I'd turned off the TV because the house felt stuffy, and I took a folding chair outside with a glass of water, figuring 10 minutes in the open would feel better than another hour indoors. My place sits on the edge of a small town in eastern Kentucky, with a row of trees behind the yard that leads into a long stretch of woods. On summer nights, you can barely hear yourself think over the cicadas. That's why it stood out when the sounds cut off. I didn't notice it at first. I was scrolling through something on my phone, half reading, half daydreaming. Then I put the phone down, and the silence hit me in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't gradual. It didn't taper off. One second, the chirping and buzzing were there, and the next second they weren't. No wind, no rustling, no distant dogs, nothing. Just dead still. It made me sit up straight. You don't get silence like that out there unless something big moves through. A person, a bear, sometimes a stray dog. I leaned forward in the chair, listening for footsteps or twigs breaking. The air felt thicker somehow, like it was holding its breath with me. I glanced toward the tree line, expecting to see movement. The trees were dark silhouettes, nothing more. No shifting shadows, no pairs of eyes catching the porch light. Then, the blue glow appeared. At first I thought it was a car turning onto one of the back roads near the woods, headlights bouncing through the trees. Except the color wasn't right. It was a pale blue, almost like moonlight reflected off water, except there wasn't any water out there. It was also too steady, no flickering, no pattern like headlights flashing between trunks. It drifted higher, clearing the tops of the trees. Perfectly smooth, no sound at all. I leaned forward so slowly I barely felt myself move. The glow wasn't bright enough to light up the yard, but it was enough to make the leaves under it look washed out, like a dim lantern hung way too high. It moved from left to right, not fast, not slow, just steady, like it was following a path. I tried to think of a drone, maybe some neighbor messing around with one of those high-end models. But it didn't behave like a drone. No wobble, no small course corrections, no noise. Absolutely none. The night was so still I would have heard even a cheap one. My phone was still on the armrest of the chair. I reached for it without taking my eyes off the glow. The second my hand touched the phone, the blue light paused. Not faded. Paused, like it froze in place. I let go of the phone immediately. The glow drifted again, same pace as before, like nothing had happened. I tried again, slower, just sliding my fingers toward the phone. This time the glow dimmed slightly, like something inside it contracted and then brightened again to the same level. It didn't stop moving, but the change was obvious enough that I jerked my hand back without even thinking. I didn't touch the phone after that. The glow reached the middle of the tree line and started rising. Not sharply, just enough that it shifted from hovering above the trees to floating higher into the sky. I stood without realizing I'd done it. My chair creaked behind me. The glow kept rising, still silent, still smooth, still impossibly steady. When it was maybe 2 or 3 times the height of the trees, it dimmed again. This time it stayed dim, shrinking into itself, almost like a paper lantern being closed. The edges blurred until it was just a hazy patch of light. Then that patch stretched upward, thinning into a shape I couldn't make sense of, like a smear on glass. It vanished a second later, not drifted away, vanished. The silence stayed. I stood there waiting for the cicadas to start again. I don't know how long it took, maybe 10 seconds, maybe a full minute, but when they came back suddenly, the exact same way they'd stopped. A full wall of sound switching back on. It actually made me jump. I sat back down slowly, keeping my eyes on the sky. Nothing else moved. No glow, no odd shapes, just the normal summer night. I finally picked up my phone, half expecting the battery to be dead or the screen to glitch. It was fine. Everything looked normal. I stayed outside another half hour, hoping maybe I'd imagined it and something would prove me wrong. Nothing did. The next night, I tried sitting on the porch again, thinking maybe whatever I'd seen had some explanation I hadn't considered. The insect noise stayed normal. No silence, no glow. But every so often, I caught myself staring at that same line of trees, waiting for the night to cut out again like someone hitting a switch. I never saw the glow again, but I still check without thinking, half expecting the air to go still, and that pale blue shape to drift into view like it had somewhere to be, passing above me without even noticing I was there. I was alone on Pine Lantern Lake the evening it happened. I'd gotten off work late and didn't feel like going home right away, so I grabbed my rod and drove out to the little public launch near the northern cove. It was one of those July evenings where the heat finally gives up after sunset and the air settles into something soft and quiet. There were no other cars in the gravel lot, which wasn't unusual on a weekday. The place isn't exactly known for producing trophy fish. I paddled my old aluminum canoe out maybe 100 yards and let it drift. The water was calm, not glass flat, but close, with these small ripples moving in slow, lazy lines. I remember thinking how nice it was that the mosquitoes hadn't come out in full force yet. The sky was fading into that slate blue shade that's not quite night, but not really day either. I just cast near a half-submerged log when I noticed something on the water. It wasn't movement, exactly, just a patch where the lake looked a shade brighter than the rest. At first, I thought it might be sunlight reflecting off something under the surface, but the sun was already behind the tree line. I leaned forward a bit. The patch glowed faintly, not bright enough to light anything around it, but enough to register as different, like someone had dropped a weak flashlight into the water, but deeper down. I told myself it was probably some kind of bioluminescent algae bloom. We'd had a warm month, and the lake wasn't particularly deep. But algae blooms don't move like that. The glow slid sideways, smoothly, too smoothly. No hesitation, no ripple around it. It wasn't bobbing or drifting with the current. It traveled in a perfect straight line, as if whatever was making the light was completely unaffected by the water around it. My canoe didn't even rock when it passed beneath me, though I swear I felt something, just a soft pressure shift in my stomach, the way you might feel when an elevator first starts moving. I sat there gripping the sides of the canoe without realizing it. The light kept moving until it passed under the shadow of a pine cluster near the shoreline. Then it faded. Not abruptly, not like a switch turning off. It was more like it slipped into deeper water and became part of the dark. I should have paddled back right then, but I didn't. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Lakes do weird things. Lights reflect. Fish schools move in strange patterns. But the longer I sat there, the more the air around me seemed heavier. It wasn't cold, just dense somehow. The usual sounds, crickets, frogs, distant traffic, felt muted. I checked my phone to see if I had reception. I did, but the battery percentage had dropped almost 15% since I left shore. I hadn't used it. It wasn't hot or running any apps. It shouldn't have done that. When I looked back up, the water near the canoe seemed darker than before. Not darker like nighttime, darker like depth. The lake was relatively shallow in that cove, maybe 10 feet at most, but staring down it looked bottomless. I dipped my paddle in out of reflex, and the water was perfectly still. I didn't even get the typical concentric ripples. It was like the lake had turned syrup thick for a second. Then, a few yards away, a second glow appeared, smaller than the first, maybe the size of my palm, and much dimmer, like a dying ember. It stayed in place for a long moment, just hovering under the surface. I didn't move. I didn't breathe much either. I don't know how long it lingered there. Maybe 10 seconds. Maybe 30. Then it began to rise. Not bursting upward, not drifting like something buoyant, rising at a perfectly constant speed. The glow expanded slightly, and before my brain could make sense of it, it faded again. This time only a foot below the surface. The water didn't swirl. No bubbles, no rings, nothing that should have happened if an object was ascending or descending. The lake just swallowed the light, completely indifferent. I finally found the nerve to paddle toward shore. I didn't turn my back on the water until the bow scraped into the mud. I dragged the canoe up past the reeds and sat on the shore for a minute, catching my breath. The sky was darker now, and the moon hadn't fully risen yet. Pine silhouettes pressed together like a wall behind me. I could hear rustling in the branches, but nothing unusual. Then my phone buzzed. I didn't have it open or anything, it just vibrated once in my pocket. When I pulled it out, the screen was on the camera app. The front-facing camera, recording. I swear I hadn't touched a thing. I ended the recording and checked the file. The clip was only 2 seconds long. The first second was just my pocket darkness. The second, I don't know how to describe it. There was a faint bloom of white light near the top corner of the frame, like a flashlight beam pointing down from somewhere above. It wasn't a reflection. I was sitting under trees. There was nothing above me but branches. The light didn't move. It just hovered in that corner for a fraction of a second before the video cut out. I told myself it was some kind of artifact from the phone being jostled. But the shape wasn't blurred. It was clean, almost oval. I didn't stay at the lake any longer. Driving home, the road felt unusually empty. The sky looked cloudless, but every few minutes I thought I saw something pale flickering between treetops in my peripheral vision. Maybe it was headlights from distant houses. Maybe not. Back at my place, I rinsed the dirt off the canoe and leaned it against the garage. I remember glancing up at the sky, expecting to see stars. I did see them. But for a moment, it looked like a cluster near the eastern horizon was spread farther apart than it should have been, like something had moved through them. The next morning, I checked the lake conditions online to see if anyone had reported algae or odd reflections. Nothing. No advisories, no events, no drone hobbyist videos, nothing at all. I don't tell this story often. Most people just hear glowing underwater and jump straight to jokes or explanations that don't fit what I saw. And I don't know what I saw. I've fished that lake since I was 12. I know how boats reflect, how fish flash, how light bends at dusk. This wasn't any of that. The part I think about most isn't even the glow itself. It's the way the water stayed perfectly still when something moved beneath it. Like the lake wasn't responding to the thing. Like the laws that usually apply just didn't right then. I've gone back to Pine Lantern Lake since, but only during the day. And even then, I don't drift out to the center anymore. I stay near shore, where the light behaves the way it's supposed to, and the water feels like water. Nothing unusual has happened again. Not yet anyway. I was hauling recycling bins to the curb when my neighbor, Mr. Delaney, called over from his driveway. He's one of those guys who's always up late, always noticing things. Usually it's raccoons, stray cats, or cars that don't belong on our street. That morning, he walked over with a kind of curious squint. "Hey, Alex," he said. "You all right last night?" I told him, yeah. I'd gone to bed early. He nodded slowly and said, "Saw some lights over your place, real bright ones. Figured maybe you were doing something out back." I wasn't. I hadn't even gotten up to get water. I remember sleeping pretty heavily, actually. The kind of sleep where you wake up in the same position you fell asleep in. I didn't think much of what he said at first. People spot strange reflections or passing planes all the time. But something about the way he said it stuck with me. Not alarmed, but bothered. Like he wasn't sure he should have mentioned it. I shrugged it off and finished dragging the bins out. When I went back inside, though, I found myself walking straight to the living room TV where the security camera feed was set up. Just curiosity. That's what I told myself. If there'd been some weird car or something, I wanted to know. I scrolled back through the footage from around midnight. Normal stuff. A cat cutting through the yard, a moth smacking into the camera. My porch light flickering a little the way it always did when the bulb was going out. I scanned forward, watching the red timeline crawl along. Then the footage jumped. Not a glitch where it froze for a second. It full-on skipped a chunk of time. One frame was labeled 12:47:15 and the next was 12:49:3. Almost 2 minutes gone. No error icon, no corrupted file message, just missing. Right before the skip, there was a flash. Not like lightning, more like someone shined a giant flashlight at the camera for a split second. The yard went pale white, every blade of grass washed out. The porch railing looked like a blown-out photo. then nothing. Jump to darkness again. I replayed the few seconds around it a half dozen times. The flash didn't behave like any normal light. It had no direction. Usually you can tell where a light source is by how shadows stretch or bend. This one just erased them. Everything became the same flat color. I told myself the camera was glitching. Cheap device, old wiring, maybe humidity got inside it. But the timestamp skip wouldn't leave my head. Cameras don't just decide to ignore 2 minutes of recording. That bugged me enough that after work I walked back outside to check the camera physically. The casing was cool to the touch, no signs of overheating or power issues. The cables were snug, no marks on the lens. When I turned around, I noticed something else. The grass near the back fence looked lighter than the rest. Not yellowed, not burned, just pale, like it had been bleached a shade. It wasn't shaped like a footprint or a tire track, more like a soft, uneven patch about 5 feet wide. I don't know why, but I crouched down and put my hand on it. The grass felt normal, maybe a little dry. Nothing that explained the color difference. When I stood back up, the hair on my arms was raised even though there wasn't any wind. For the next couple days, nothing strange happened. I still checked the camera feed every night before bed. Nothing but raccoons, headlights from passing cars, and the occasional glare when the lens caught my porch light. Then Friday night, I woke up for no clear reason. Not a noise, not a dream. I just opened my eyes and felt awake. Too awake. I glanced at my phone. 2:58 a.m. I lay there trying to settle back down, and that's when I noticed the faintest hint of brightness slipping under the bedroom door. Not enough to light the room, but enough to make a soft outline around the frame. I figured maybe I'd left a hall light on. I got up, walked over, opened the door. The hallway was dark, completely dark. But my security monitor, the small one mounted by the kitchen entry, had a soft glow across the screen. Not an alert, just the camera feed lighting up the display. Normally it only did that when motion was detected. I walked closer. The yard on the monitor was bright again. Not as intense as the flash before, but lit enough that the grass almost looked silver. I didn't see anything moving. No person, no car, nothing blowing in the wind. But the brightness wasn't coming from my porch light either. It was coming from above. The tops of the bushes were lit, not the base. I stepped closer until I could hear the soft buzz of the monitor's speaker. Except it wasn't buzzing. It was humming. A low, steady tone that didn't rise or fall. More like the vibration you hear inside a power station, except too clean, too pure. I tapped the screen, the feed jumped again, 2:58 to 3:09, and the light vanished mid-jump. The humming stopped too, instantly. Not faded, stopped. The yard returned to normal darkness. I must have stood there a full 5 minutes, staring at the screen, before finally turning away. I checked the locks on every door and window without even thinking about it. I crawled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I went outside first thing. The pale patch of grass was still there by the fence, but now there was a second one, a similar shape, maybe 8 feet away from the first. Same lightened color, same irregular outline. I didn't touch it this time. Around noon, I ran into Mr. Delaney again when I was grabbing the mail. He said something offhand like, "Didn't see anything strange last night. Guess whatever it was moved on." He chuckled like it was a harmless joke. I asked him what he'd seen originally. He said he wasn't sure, just bright shapes drifting over my roofline. He thought maybe I had friends over with drones. I told him no, and he shrugged and said, "Well, they weren't shaped like drones, more like floating lamps or something." Floating lamps. I didn't respond. That night, I checked the camera again. No flashes, no skips, nothing out of place. Still, I kept watching that yard, half convinced the grass would start glowing or shifting or something, but it just sat there, normal as ever. I haven't told anyone besides writing this, not because I'm scared of sounding strange, though I guess that's part of it, but because the whole thing feels like it only half happened. Like my mind is waiting for the missing pieces to show up. Every night since then, I check the camera feed before bed, and every time the screen flickers, even for a split second, I hold my breath without meaning to. I keep thinking about those missing timestamps. Not the lights, not the humming, just those blank stretches of time the camera didn't record. I don't know why that part feels like the most important detail. It just does. I came awake so fast it felt like I'd been yanked upward out of sleep. No dream, no sound, nothing clear to latch onto, just this absolute certainty that someone had been standing right next to my bed. It wasn't fear at first, more like the leftover echo of a presence, a pressure in the room, the way you can tell someone's behind you even before you look. I held still for a few seconds, waiting for my eyes to adjust. My room was dark, but not pitch black. Streetlight glow filtered through the curtains, a faint orange band along the ceiling. Everything looked normal. My dresser was where it always was. My backpack slumped against the chair, the door cracked the way I usually left it, but the sense that someone had been there hadn't faded. It clung to the air in this uncomfortable way, like the room hadn't quite settled back to what it was supposed to be. Eventually, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up, and the brightness felt harsh. It was 3:27 a.m. When I shifted to sit up, my hand brushed the curtain closest to the bed. It was warm, not hot, not dangerous, just warm enough to feel out of place. My room was usually cool at night. The AC kicked on around midnight, so the fabric should have been cold. Instead, the curtain felt like it does when sunlight has been heating it all afternoon. I ran my hand across it again, slower this time. The warmth wasn't uniform. The center of the curtain was warmest, fading at the edges, almost like something had been behind it, or in front of it. I peeked out through the window. The street outside looked empty. No cars, no people, just the glow from a lamp 2 houses down. My heartbeat had started creeping up, but I kept telling myself not to jump to conclusions. Curtains can hold heat. Maybe the heater vent had shifted somehow. Maybe I'd brushed against it earlier in the night. Still, when I let the curtain fall back into place, I double-checked the lock on the window. It hadn't been touched. I sat on the edge of the bed for a minute, waiting for the adrenaline to wear off. But the longer I stayed awake, the stranger the room felt. Quiet in a way I didn't usually notice. Not peaceful quiet, more like the air itself was paused, waiting. That's when I noticed the faintest flicker of light on my wall. Just a tiny pulse, barely there. At first, I thought it was a car passing on the street, but when I looked outside again, nothing was moving. The street light was steady. No headlights, no motion sensors kicking on anywhere. The pulse came again, softer than before, like something reflecting off glass but from a weird angle. I checked my phone screen, thinking maybe it was a notification lighting up. Nothing, just the blank "no service" icon in the corner, which was strange by itself. I never lost service in my house. I held the phone up higher, watching the bars. They stayed gone. I don't know why that rattled me more than the curtain. Maybe because it was the kind of thing that shouldn't happen without a reason. Service can drop, sure, but not randomly at 3 in the morning when nothing else is going wrong. A few seconds later, a soft vibration rolled through the floor. Not strong enough to shake anything. More like standing over a distant train track, but muted, as if the vibration didn't quite belong to a physical source. It lasted maybe half a second, just long enough to make me freeze. Then, it stopped. The house went silent again. I checked the hallway. It was dark and undisturbed. The living room light, which I usually turned off before bed, was still off. The deadbolt on the front door was in place. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. But when I stepped back into my room, the air felt different, warmer, drier, like the atmosphere had shifted in those few seconds I'd been gone. I turned in a slow circle, taking in everything. And somehow, the thing that bothered me most was that nothing had changed visibly. It's one thing to find a window open or a chair moved. It's another to feel like the room has been altered without any sign of how. I went back to the curtains. They were cooling down now. Still a little warm, but not like before. I pressed my palm flat against the fabric and felt a faint residual heat at the center. It reminded me of the warmth left on a car hood after the engine's been off for a while. I checked the window latch again, even though I already knew it wasn't tampered with. I stood there for a long time, just listening, waiting for anything to explain what I'd felt when I woke up, that sense that someone had been inches from me. Eventually, I lay back down, though I didn't close my eyes right away. I kept staring toward the curtains, half expecting another flicker of light or some hint of movement behind them. But nothing else happened. When morning came, the room felt normal again. My phone had service. The curtains were cool, no marks on the floor, no signs that anyone had been there. I tried to chalk the whole thing up to sleep paralysis or a dream spike, even though I've never had those before. But something about that explanation didn't fit. I didn't wake frozen or gasping. I didn't see anything looming over me. It wasn't a hallucination. It was just a presence, and the warmth that shouldn't have been there. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened my phone's photo gallery to see if maybe I'd accidentally taken a picture during the night. Nothing. But when I checked the battery usage screen, I saw that the camera app had been active around 3:20 a.m. Not recording, just open. I don't remember touching my phone. I don't know what opened it. I didn't sleep well for a few nights after that. Every time I glanced at the window in the dark, I felt that same pressure in the air, like the room wasn't entirely empty, like the warmth on the curtain had been the leftover trace of something I didn't see. I haven't felt anything since. The curtains stay cool now, but sometimes I still wake up suddenly, heart pounding for no reason. And before I move, I always check the air, just to make sure it feels normal, just to make sure the room is really empty this time. The power went out halfway through a movie, right when I was starting to drift off on the couch. At first, I thought it was just my building. They do maintenance at odd hours sometimes, but when I looked outside, the entire cul-de-sac was dark. Even the streetlights were out. It was a cold night, late November, the kind where you can see your breath indoors if the heat cuts off long enough. I grabbed my hoodie, went out onto the small back deck, and leaned against the railing. Everything felt muted, without the usual hum from the neighbors' HVAC units and all the electronics inside the house. Even the dogs that usually bark nonstop were quiet. I stood there for maybe a minute before I realized the sky didn't look right. At first, it was subtle. I thought my eyes were just adjusting to the dark, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. The sky wasn't black. It wasn't even clouded. It had this faint, diffuse sheen to it, like brushed metal. Not bright or glowing, just reflective, in a way a sky shouldn't be. Like there was something thin and uniform stretched across it. I blinked several times, trying to see if it was just the contrast after stepping out of the house, but it didn't go away. If anything, it became clearer. The stars weren't visible at all, not even the low ones near the horizon. The sky looked smooth, featureless, and too still. I remember muttering something like, "What the hell?" under my breath, because I genuinely couldn't figure out what I was looking at. It wasn't lightning. There weren't any clouds, and it wasn't a reflection from anything on the ground. There wasn't any power. Then the air changed. It wasn't wind. It was more like pressure shifting, the kind you feel before a storm, except there was no storm forecast. My ears popped slightly, enough to make me swallow. The trees in the yard didn't move. Nothing rustled. Everything stayed still. For about 3 seconds, maybe 4, the metallic look deepened, like the entire sky was made of dull aluminum catching some distant source of light. There wasn't an exact direction the light was coming from. It just existed, like the sky itself was the thing giving off the faint sheen. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it faded, not gradually. One moment it was that strange, silvery color, and the next it was just nighttime again. Totally black, starless, but normal. Right then, all the power snapped back on. The deck light behind me flicked on, the neighbor's porch lights blinked awake, and the hum of appliances inside my house resumed. It startled me enough that I spun around, half convinced someone had flipped a switch behind me. When I looked at the sky again, there was nothing unusual, just darkness. The stars didn't come back right away, but the sky looked like any other overcast, light-polluted night. I went back inside and shut the door behind me, but the strange part was how the house felt. Warmer than before the outage. Not stuffy, just noticeably warmer in a way that didn't match the thermostat, which was still off from the power cut. I sat back down on the couch, not even bothering to restart the movie. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting the sky to shift again. It didn't. After a few minutes, I decided to check the local outage maps on my phone. The power company's site was flooded with reports, but none of them mentioned anything unusual. Just equipment failure, service restored, the usual stuff. When I clicked on my phone's weather app, it wouldn't load. The little icon spun for a while and then returned a generic error. No big deal, probably just my service resetting. Except when I tried to check another site, it did the same thing. Everything except basic texting and calling wouldn't load, like data was throttled or stuck. I turned the phone off and on again. Same issue. Eventually, I gave up and went to bed. I slept lightly, waking up several times because of sounds that might have been nothing: creaks, hums, maybe the fridge kicking back on fully. But every time I looked out the window, the sky was dark and normal. The next morning, my neighbor, a guy named Marcus who teaches middle school science, waved me over as I was getting into my car. He asked if I'd noticed the weird, bright fog last night. That's how he described it: bright fog. I asked him what he meant, and he said he'd been walking his dog in the front yard when the sky glinted. That was the word he used. Glinted, not glowed. He thought it was something like atmospheric interference, or maybe some kind of aurora, even though we're way too far south for that. I didn't tell him what I saw. I just nodded and said, yeah, something seemed off. Later that afternoon, I tried searching for explanations. Metallic sky, sky sheen, sky reflection during power outage. All I got were photos of auroras and a couple of forum posts about light pollution weirdness. Nothing like what I'd seen. The part that stuck with me, though, was the suddenness. The sky didn't transition. It didn't shift between states. It was one thing, then the next, like a screen turning on and off. A few days after that, I checked my phone's system logs, not because I expected to find anything unusual, but because I was bored and curious. I noticed a connectivity drop recorded at exactly 12:41 a.m., which matched the moment I stepped outside and saw the metallic sky. The log said unknown network interruption. Normally it would say tower unavailable or signal lost, but this time it didn't give a reason. I asked around at work, casually, if anyone else had experienced the outage. A couple of people had, but no one mentioned the sky. One woman complained that her smart thermostat reset itself and wiped her schedule. Another guy said his garage door opener malfunctioned afterward and wouldn't pair with the remote for a full day. Little glitches. Nothing dramatic. That night, I went back to the deck around the same time just to check. The sky was dark and ordinary. A plane blinked across it. The air felt normal. The neighborhood hummed with its usual noise. Cars, TVs, some teenagers down the street playing music too loudly. Everything was exactly as it should be. But a small part of me kept replaying those seconds when the sky looked metallic, like there was something just above us, something that electricity somehow revealed or disturbed, or maybe the absence of electricity did. I haven't seen it again, and the outage hasn't repeated. Still, sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I check the window before anything else. Not because I expect to see something, just because I need to make sure the sky looks the way it's supposed to. The fog was already bad enough that night. Thick in the way coastal fog gets when it settles low and refuses to shift. I was driving home from my friend Lucas's place in Mendocino, taking the back road along Navarro Ridge because Highway 1 was closed from a rockslide earlier that week. It was past midnight, cold, and the kind of quiet where even the engine felt too loud. I had the defroster on full blast, creeping along at maybe 20 miles an hour, trying to make out more than a few yards of road at a time. The fog didn't just hang, it moved, drifting in slow curls, almost like it was reacting to my headlights. About 10 minutes in, I saw headlights ahead of me. Two bright white circles hanging in the fog, exactly the shape and height of a car coming toward me. They weren't moving, though. They just hovered there, maybe 100 feet away, unwavering. I let off the gas, waiting for them to get closer or shift or do anything, but they stayed perfectly still. I remember saying out loud, "Okay, what are you doing?" like the other driver could hear me. The road was too narrow for a car to pull over, and if someone had stopped right there, I should have seen some kind of silhouette of a vehicle behind the lights. But there was nothing. The fog around them was bright, but nothing else showed through. I slowed to a crawl. My first thought was that the car had stalled out and the driver was stuck. My second thought, right behind that, was that no one would just sit there with their brights directly facing oncoming traffic. People around here know better. I crept forward anyway because I didn't know what else to do. The lights didn't flare or dim. They didn't jiggle like someone shifting their weight in the front seat. They just stayed there, suspended. When I reached what felt like the halfway point between us, the fog around me suddenly thinned, like a wave pulling back. For a full second, I could see perfectly. The road, the trees, my own breath, everything, except the headlights. They were gone. No car, no glow, nothing. The moment the fog thickened again, my heart started racing. I pulled over, even though there was barely any shoulder, tires crunching through wet gravel. I turned on my hazards, rolled my window down, and listened. No engine, no voices, no doors slamming, just wet fog and the faint hiss of my own hazard lights. I sat there with my hand on the wheel, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself it was some kind of refraction. Fog does weird things, especially with distant lights. It could have been a house up on the ridge or someone walking with a flashlight but no, those were headlights. Perfectly circular, perfectly spaced, exactly where a car's would be. It bothered me how still they'd been. When I started driving again, the fog somehow felt heavier, like it was pushing against the car. My high beams hardly helped. I kept checking my rearview mirror even though I couldn't see anything behind me except a dim smear of reflected light. A few minutes later, my radio cut out. Not like losing the station, just a sudden jump to dead silence. No static, no music. The screen froze like the whole system locked up. I tapped it, hit the power button, tried to switch to Bluetooth. Nothing. The screen stayed lit but unresponsive. Then the cabin got colder. Fast. I could see my breath even with the heater on, which made no sense. My temperature gauge looked normal. The engine was fine, but the air inside the car felt like it had been sitting in a freezer. I remember gripping the wheel tighter. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. The fog ahead of me shifted again. This time it didn't clear. It rippled. A long, slow ripple like wind moving across a sheet of fabric, except there was no wind. The trees weren't moving at all. I eased up on the gas, watching the fog very carefully. It stretched, thinned, and then curled inward on itself in one spot maybe 40 yards ahead. The shape reminded me of a tunnel, except nothing was inside it. Just more fog folding back and then drifting away. I didn't want to keep driving, but stopping felt worse. I just wanted to get back to the main road where I could see more than 5 feet in front of me. A couple minutes later, the radio started working again on its own. The music kicked back in at full volume, making me jump hard enough that I almost swerved. At the same moment, the car warmed up rapidly, like someone had flipped the temperature control even though I hadn't touched it. Everything felt normal again. Too normal. I drove faster than I should have the rest of the way, but I didn't see any more headlights or weird ripples. The fog stayed thick but predictable, just fog. When I finally reached a clearer stretch near town, I pulled over in the parking lot of a closed gas station and just sat there with the engine running. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages. I texted Lucas to tell him I got home safe, even though I wasn't home yet. My hands were still shaking a little. Once I got back to my apartment, I went straight to the window and looked up the weather report. Zero mention of unusual fog conditions. No atmospheric anomalies. Just dense coastal fog advisory, which is normal for that area. I barely slept. The next morning, I drove the same road in full daylight. No tire marks on the shoulder where the other car should have been. No signs of anyone pulling over. Nothing reflecting in the trees. It was just a quiet, narrow road like always. I even stopped at the exact spot where I'd seen the suspended headlights. There was nothing. No houses close enough, no reflective signs, no equipment. Just a curve in the road and trees on both sides. I stayed there for a while, listening, trying to feel whatever I felt the night before. But it was just a normal morning. Birds, faint traffic from the highway in the distance, sun cutting through the branches. Driving back, I kept thinking about how the fog had thinned all at once, almost like it was reacting to those lights rather than the other way around. I've driven that road dozens of times since then, even at night a few times. I've never seen anything like that again, but every time the fog rolls in heavy, I notice myself slowing down at that same spot, watching for headlights that don't belong. I was out behind my apartment building when it happened, at the edge of the gravel lot where the streetlights don't quite reach. I live in a small place outside Flagstaff, Timber Ridge, just a cluster of older buildings and duplexes surrounded by pines. The sky out here gets dark enough that you can actually see the stars if the neighbors keep their porch lights off, and that night most of them had. It was late, around 1 a.m. I'd been messing around with long exposure shots for a few months, trying to get better at night photography. Uh, my friend Jenna had loaned me her old DSLR, and I'd gotten into the habit of stepping outside on clear nights to play with longer shutter speeds. That night was perfect for it. Cold, dry, with barely any wind. The kind of air that feels thin and sharp when you breathe in. I set up the camera on the tripod facing a patch of sky where the pines opened up. Nothing fancy, just aiming for a long trail shot. I remember how quiet everything was. Not silent, just normal Arizona quiet. Distant traffic on the highway, an occasional dog barking somewhere down the hill, the hum of the building's AC unit flicking on. I took a few test shots. The exposures came out fine, just streaks of stars and a bit of color from a distant porch light. I was about to pack up when I noticed the sky looked especially clear toward the east, so I decided to take one more long exposure, 30 seconds. I clicked the shutter, stepped back, and stared up at the sky while it did its thing. Nothing unusual. No planes, no satellites, not even a cloud. The camera beeped when it finished, and I checked the display. That frame, just that one, had something in it. Right near the top of the shot, above the tree line, there was a dark oval shape, smooth, almost like someone had cut a hole in the sky. No texture, no lights, nothing reflective. Just absence. And it was sharp, not motion blurred like a bird or an insect, more like something that had stayed still long enough to register clearly. My first thought was that it had to be smudge or dust spot on the lens, but I'd cleaned it earlier, and the shape wasn't round like a dust spot. It was elongated, symmetrical, almost too clean. I took another shot immediately, same angle, same exposure time. When I checked it, the shape was gone. I changed settings and tried a few more exposures. 5 seconds, 15, 30 again, nothing. Just stars and trees. I should have stopped there, but something about that dark oval bugged me in a way I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about how still the air was, how nothing had flown overhead. I would have heard wings. I always hear wings at night out there. Owls, ravens, even bats make tiny noises when they pass close. This thing, whatever it was, had left nothing. Not even a sound. I aimed the camera straight up and tried again, hoping maybe I'd catch something. The sky felt different now. I don't mean that in a dramatic way, it just felt crowded. Like something was up there even though I couldn't see it. I stood perfectly still, listening. The AC unit switched off suddenly, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Every time that unit shuts off, there's at least some sound left. Cars, branches, insects. But right then, there was nothing. As if the world had paused. I looked around. The pine branches weren't moving at all. There wasn't even the faintest stir of air on my face. I clicked the shutter again. Halfway through the exposure, something passed over me. I didn't see it, not directly. There was no shape, no shadow I could point to. But the stars above me dimmed for a split second, like something wide and silent had crossed between me and them. It wasn't a cloud. The sky was crystal clear, and the dimming didn't move like a cloud. It was more like a smooth darkening that cleared instantly. The camera finished the exposure. My hands were shaking when I looked at the screen. The shot showed nothing unusual, just sky. I turned around slowly, trying not to panic. I kept expecting to see an animal behind me or a person watching, something familiar to latch onto. But the lot was empty. The building was dark. I remember whispering, "Hello?" even though I knew how stupid that was. Something answered, not with a voice, not even with a sound exactly. It was more like a vibration under my feet. A single, soft tremor through the ground, almost like a truck passing nearby. But there was no engine noise, no lights, nothing. The vibration lasted maybe 1 second. Then it stopped. I took another photo without even thinking. 30 seconds again. When it finished, I checked it. That frame had a faint streak in the upper corner, not light, dark. A stretched blur, smooth-edged, almost like the oval shape from before, but elongated. Like it had moved faster this time. I looked up, scanning the sky. The stars were normal again. The silence felt lighter, like whatever had been causing it had shifted away. I finally packed up the tripod, shoved everything into my bag, and walked quickly toward the apartment door. I didn't run, but I came close. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the trees. expecting to see that patch of sky darken again. Just before I reached the door, the AC unit flicked back on. The world felt normal instantly. Sounds came back. Cars on the highway, a dog barking somewhere far off, the low rumble of someone's TV through a wall. Nothing felt wrong anymore. Inside my apartment, I tried looking at the photos on my laptop. The dark oval in that one frame was even clearer on a bigger screen. Too clean to be a smudge, too sharp to be a bird. I zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, and the shape held its form right up until the image quality fell apart. It was like staring at something intentionally featureless. I didn't sleep much. I kept the blinds shut, but every time a car passed outside and headlights swept the room, I sat up expecting the stars to dim again. The next night, I went back outside with the camera, thinking maybe I'd imagined more than I realized. I took 20 photos. Nothing strange showed up, but I couldn't shake the memory of that pressure in the air, the dimming stars, and the vibration beneath my feet. I still take long exposures sometimes, but I'm never fully relaxed when I do. I always feel like the sky is watching back a little too carefully, waiting for me to look away. And every once in a while, when the AC unit shuts off suddenly, I stop whatever I'm doing and listen, just in case the quiet isn't normal this time. I was walking home from Marcus's place when it happened. He lives only a few blocks from me, over on Pineview, so I usually just walk instead of driving. It was around 11:30, cool but not cold, with that kind of stillness small towns get after most people have gone to bed. Streetlights in my neighborhood aren't great. Half of them flicker or buzz, but I know the route well enough that I never think much about it. I was halfway down Brookline Street, near the row of older houses with the big oak trees out front. The sidewalks there are cracked in places, pushed up by roots. I wasn't really paying attention, thinking about the leftovers Marcus sent me home with and how I probably shouldn't eat them that late, but would anyway. The first thing that felt off was just this small, nagging awareness that something behind me was a little delayed. That's the only way I can describe it. I took a step, and it felt like something else took a step a beat after me. Not a sound, not an echo, just a sense of movement that didn't match mine. I stopped walking, and the feeling stopped too. I figured maybe I was just tired. I'd been up early for work and hadn't slept well the night before. I shook it off and kept going. A dozen steps later, I saw it. My shadow, cast by the nearest streetlight, lagged behind me by a fraction of a second. Not by much. Half a beat, like a video that's slightly out of sync, but enough that I froze instantly. I stood there under the buzzing street lamp and lifted my hands slowly. My shadow lifted its hand too, but just after mine, like it needed a moment to catch up. I remember blinking hard, once, twice, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I stepped sideways, the shadow jerked in that direction just a bit too late. I wasn't imagining it. Then, just as I was starting to feel that dizziness you get right before full-on panic, the streetlight flickered. Not the usual quick stutter. This was a slow fade, like someone turning a dimmer. The edges of everything softened, and I had to squint to keep the shapes clear. That's when the glow appeared above me. It wasn't bright, just a faint, diffuse light, almost like moonlight behind clouds. But there were no clouds, and the moon wasn't even in that part of the sky. The glow moved, drifting over the street in a straight, steady path. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. The second that glow started to fade, my shadow snapped back into sync, like someone cut whatever connection had delayed it. I didn't move at first. I just stood there listening. The entire street had gone quiet. Even the wind had stopped. When the glow finally disappeared, fading upward until it blended into the night, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I started walking again, trying to act normal, even though my heart was doing this uneven thumping in my chest. I didn't want to run, even though I wanted to more than anything. Running felt like it would acknowledge something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. At the next intersection, I slowed down, partly to check my shadow without making it obvious, even though no one else was around. It looked normal again. Perfectly synced. No delay. I crossed the street and kept my eyes mostly forward, but every now and then I glanced at the ground, testing it again. Nothing strange. Just a normal shadow under the dim orange streetlights. I tried to convince myself it had been some weird trick of the light, a passing car with its high beams angled strangely, or the flickering street lamp messing with the shape. But no cars had gone by, and the shadow hadn't distorted, shifted, or blurred like from headlights. It had been clean, sharp, and unmistakably late. When I turned onto my street, I noticed something else. The air felt lighter. That's not the right word, but I don't know another one. Like the pressure had changed, the way it does before a storm. Except it wasn't windy and the sky was clear. I walked faster without meaning to. 2 houses from mine, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Not a notification, just the vibration that happens when it restarts. I pulled it out, confused. It had rebooted on its own. Time and date looked fine, but all my open apps had closed. I looked up at the sky again. Nothing there. No glow. Inside my house, everything looked exactly how I'd left it. I put Marcus's leftovers in the fridge and stood at the kitchen sink for a minute, checking my shadow on the tile floor. Normal. Completely normal. I went to bed later than I meant to because I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not in a dramatic way, just in that low-level, restless way where your brain keeps replaying something without your permission. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my hand lifting and the shadow lifting just slightly too late. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up around 4 in the morning with the kind of alertness that doesn't come from a dream. I didn't hear anything, but the room felt too warm, like someone had turned up the heat. I sat up and listened. Nothing. I walked to the window and peeked outside. The street was dark, empty, still. I checked the sky. Clear. No glow. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had been there earlier, something that hadn't bothered to make noise or shape or anything visible, just a faint light and a shadow acting wrong. In the morning, when I walked the same route to Marcus's to return a book he'd lent me, I checked the street lamp. It buzzed like usual. No dimming, no flickering beyond the normal. My shadow stayed perfectly synced the entire time. I've walked that route 100 times since then. Nothing weird has happened again. But every so often, when I'm alone on that street and the night is quiet enough, I'll look at my shadow through the corner of my eye just to make sure it's still behaving the way shadows should. So far, it has, but I don't think the thing that caused it was a trick of light anymore. It felt too intentional, like something moved overhead, and whatever it was, my shadow responded before I even realized it was there. The horizon started glowing way too early. That's what kicked everything off. I was out behind my cousin Daniel's cabin in northern Wisconsin, sitting on an old overturned canoe at the edge of the tree line. I hadn't slept all night, partly because the cot inside was uncomfortable, and partly because I'd had too much cheap gas station coffee on the drive up. It was maybe 4 in the morning, still pitch dark except for a sliver of moon, and I was just waiting for something like tiredness to finally hit me. Instead, the eastern horizon brightened. At first, I thought I'd lost track of time and dawn was coming early, but it didn't look right. The light didn't spread out the way sunrise normally does. It was all concentrated in one narrow band, like someone had turned on a giant floodlight just beyond the tree line. Everything went this washed-out pale yellow, and I remember thinking it looked artificial somehow, even though I couldn't explain why. The glow stayed there, hovering low and steady, and the birds didn't make a sound. Usually they start chirping even before the first bit of dawn, but the whole forest was dead quiet. Even the mosquitoes had stopped whining around my ears. I stood up from the canoe, half expecting a truck or something to come driving over the ridge, but the light didn't behave like headlights. It wasn't moving, it wasn't shifting or fading out, it was just fixed. Then it started to contract. Not dimming, contracting. Pulling upward, almost like someone was rolling the horizon upward into the sky. The light thinned into a narrow column, lifting straight up until it was nothing but a pale pinpoint overhead, and then it disappeared completely. I just stood there for a long minute, trying to process what I'd seen. I kept replaying it in my head, comparing it to things that made sense: meteors, planes, reflections, distant buildings, but nothing fit. There were no towns in that direction, no roads with big lights, no factories, just miles and miles of forest. When the sounds came back, they came back all at once. A woodpecker hammered somewhere to my left. The mosquitoes returned like they'd been waiting for a cue. and a wind picked up out of nowhere, cold enough to sting. I told myself I was overtired and imagining things. It wasn't a good explanation, but it was the only one that didn't involve me turning around and heading home in the dark like a scared kid. I went inside the cabin, made instant oatmeal, and tried not to keep checking the horizon every few seconds. Daniel wasn't supposed to show up until the next afternoon, and I didn't want to text him something vague like, "The sky folded upward this morning." He'd just think I was screwing with him. By late morning, I'd convinced myself I'd exaggerated the whole thing. Lack of sleep can do weird stuff. Maybe I'd nodded off and dreamed the part where the light moved. That seemed like the safest interpretation. But when I stepped outside around noon to chop kindling, I noticed the air felt wrong. Not hot or cold, just thick, like the pressure had changed. I kept yawning, trying to pop my ears, but it didn't help. That feeling stuck around the entire afternoon. Around 4, I walked down to the lake with my fishing rod, mostly out of habit. The lake was calm, no boats or noise. I cast a few times and tried to relax, but every ripple on the water caught my attention. Every little rustle in the trees made my shoulders tense. I kept checking the treetops across the lake, expecting, I don't know what, something. I was halfway through reeling in when the air pressure dropped again. Not gradually, fast, like someone had opened a huge vacuum above the tree line. My ears popped hard enough to ache. The water went still, totally flat, like a sheet of glass. Then the light came back. Not on the horizon this time. This time it appeared straight overhead, faint but noticeable, like a soft white blur behind invisible clouds. It drifted slowly in a line across the lake, moving far too smoothly to be an aircraft. No sound, no blinking, no trail, just a pale smear gliding from one edge of the sky to the other. I stood up and backed toward shore without meaning to. The rod hung limp in my hands. The light kept drifting until it reached the far tree line where it paused. Not slowed, paused, like it was considering something. Then it contracted again, upward, a thin vertical line shrinking toward a single point until it vanished. When it was gone, the pressure snapped back to normal. The water rippled from a sudden breeze. Birds cried out again. Everything returned instantly, like someone had lifted a mute button. I didn't stay by the lake after that. I packed up and went back to the cabin, trying not to walk too fast. Inside, I checked my phone. It was on, but the clock was wrong. Not by much, maybe 10 minutes, but it was behind, even though the battery hadn't died. I reset it, shrugged it off. I spent the rest of the evening inside, reading to distract myself. By the time it got dark, the wind had picked up and the cabin creaked a little with each gust. I checked the windows more than necessary. Around midnight, the pressure changed again. I was lying on the cot, half asleep, when the room tightened around me. My ears popped. My skin prickled like the air had turned dense and electric. I sat up, expecting thunder or lightning, but the night was completely clear. I went to the window. Nothing outside was moving. Not the branches, not the grass, not the insects. It felt like the entire world had been put on pause. Then, through the treetops to the east, I saw a faint glow rising upward. Very faint, barely visible, but rising in that same contracting motion as before. Not spreading, not illuminating anything around it, just pulling upward until it vanished. The instant it disappeared, a gust of wind slammed against the cabin so hard it rattled the hinges. My ears popped again, and then everything returned to normal. Crickets, rustling leaves, distant night sounds. I sat there long after the wind died, staring at the dark treetops and trying to slow down my breathing. I didn't open the door. I didn't step outside. I didn't even turn off the lamp. I just sat there until the sun finally started coming up for real. The real sunrise looked the way it always did, soft and gradual, spreading outward the way light should. When Daniel arrived later that day, I didn't tell him much, just that I hadn't slept well and the woods felt off. He laughed and said the place always felt weird before storms, even though there were no storms in the forecast. I didn't argue. I doubt I could have explained what I saw in a way that made sense. Even now, I don't know how to describe it without feeling like I'm leaving something out. I just know the horizon shouldn't brighten like that, and light shouldn't move upward. I was out behind my house when it happened, just leaning against the porch rail and letting the dog wander around the yard. It was one of those warm September nights where everything feels muted and slow. I live on the edge of town in a place called Willow Creek. Not the famous one, just a small township in Missouri that barely shows up on maps. Out here, the sky gets dark enough that you can see most of the Milky Way on a clear night. It was close to 11 p.m. The air had been still all day, not a hint of wind. I remember that because the humidity had been hanging on everything, and even at night you could feel it pressing on your skin. My dog, a beagle mix named Rusty, usually perked up at every noise, but he was strangely quiet, sniffing in a lazy circle near the fire pit. I didn't notice anything unusual until the pressure dropped. It felt exactly like the moment before a storm breaks, when your ears pop a little and the air gets heavy and empty at the same time. Except there were no clouds. The sky had been clear all evening, and the forecast didn't mention so much as a drizzle. I straightened up, thinking maybe a cold front was rolling in. Rusty froze, nose lifted, tail stiff. That was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. He never froze like that unless he heard something I couldn't. A second later, the pressure dropped again. Sharper this time, like stepping into a plane cabin after takeoff. My ears popped hard enough to make me blink. I glanced toward the western tree line, half expecting to see lightning far off. But the whole sky was dark, calm, too calm. Even the insects had gone quiet. I only realized it when I noticed the silence felt artificial, like someone had hit a mute button on the whole yard. Then the orb appeared. At first, it looked like a faint smudge of light hovering low on the horizon, almost like a star seen through haze. I remember thinking it must be headlights from a distant truck on the county road, catching some fog I couldn't see. Except the light wasn't white or yellow. It had a pale, washed-out look to it, almost silvery. It didn't blink. It didn't waver. It just hung there. Rusty started whining. I took a step forward, gripping the porch rail. The orb lifted, slowly, straight upward, as if being pulled by a string. Not accelerating, not drifting, like just rising at a constant pace. I told myself it had to be a drone. Someone out late messing around with one of those high-powered things that can go a mile up. But I've seen drones. They wobble, they buzz, they shift with the wind. This thing didn't make a single sound, and the air was dead still around me. I could hear my own heartbeat. That's how quiet it was. About halfway up, the orb dimmed. Not instantly, but in a fade, like someone turning a dial down. The higher it went, the less distinct it became, until it was only barely visible as a faint, glowing seed against the sky. Then it stretched. Not upward, sideways. Like the light itself smeared across a small patch of the horizon. A thin, horizontal streak, almost too faint to see. I blinked, and the streak snapped back into a tight point. Then the point faded completely. The pressure returned all at once. My ears popped again, this time the opposite way, like air rushing back into a sealed room. Rusty barked sharply, then backed up against my leg. The night sounds came back in a wave. Crickets, distant cars, the hum of power lines. Everything returned to normal as if somebody had flipped the switch back on. I stood there for maybe a minute, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The horizon was empty. The sky looked untouched. I should have gone inside right then, but instead I walked to the edge of the yard. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe? Or the feeling that if I didn't look closer, I'd convince myself I imagined the whole thing. When I reached the fence, I felt another tiny pressure change. Just a flicker. Like the air inhaled. Rusty growled low, barely audible. I waited, staring into the dark fields behind my house, expecting the orb to reappear. Instead, I heard something. A soft clicking sound, rhythmic, almost insect-like. But it wasn't coming from the grass or the trees. It sounded higher up, like it was drifting in from above me. I looked up and saw nothing. No lights, no movement, just stars. The clicking stopped abruptly like it had been cut off mid-pattern. I backed away without realizing it, keeping my eyes on the sky. The air felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was still hanging there, unseen, watching, waiting. It was like looking at a perfectly calm lake while knowing something big was just beneath the surface. I finally went inside and locked the door, even though I knew a lock didn't matter if whatever I'd seen wanted to come closer. Rusty paced in circles for long before settling by the front door, like he thought he needed to guard it. I checked the news, weather alerts, social media, nothing. No storms, no meteor sightings, no transformer failures or helicopter activity. If someone else saw what I did, they weren't talking about it. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd get this weird feeling of weightlessness in my chest, like my breathing wasn't syncing with the room. Twice I got up to look outside, and both times the sky looked too normal, too clean. The next morning, on my way to work, I drove past the field behind my house. Nothing was out of place. No equipment, no tire tracks, no scorch marks or anything. But the air still felt a little off, like walking into a room where someone had just been standing, even though you didn't see them leave. I went through the day convincing myself it was some kind of atmospheric thing, temperature inversion maybe, or ball lightning, though I've never heard of ball lightning rising that slowly. I kept telling myself there had to be a real explanation. But the part that stuck with me wasn't the light itself. It was the silence. That total, unnatural silence that wrapped around everything before the orb appeared. I've lived in the country my whole life. I know what night sounds like. The absence of it felt wrong in a way I can't put into normal words. That night, when Rusty refused to go into the yard after dark, I didn't push him. I didn't stay out there long either. I still go outside sometimes, trying to convince myself I'll never see that pale light again. But even on quiet nights, when the sky is clear and nothing strange happens, I catch myself paying attention to the pressure in the air, waiting for that sudden hollow drop, and wondering if, somewhere near the horizon, something is waiting too. I woke up at 2:17 a.m. to this soft tapping sound on my bedroom window. Not a knock, not like a branch scraping, more like someone lightly flicking their fingernail against the glass at slow, even intervals. I remember the exact time because the red digits on my alarm clock too bright in the darkness, like the power had surged for a second. At first, I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. My neighborhood outside Duluth is usually dead quiet at night. Woods on three sides, only a few houses spaced far apart. If anything ever wakes me up, it's coyotes or the occasional plow truck in winter. But this tapping didn't sound like an animal. It was too controlled. Tap, 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 3 seconds between each one. After maybe the fifth tap, I sat up slowly. My heart rate jumped, but I kept telling myself it was probably a loose piece of siding or something blown from the porch. Except there was no wind. I would have heard it in the trees. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black and wouldn't turn on. No low battery icon, no vibration, nothing. It was fine when I went to sleep. The tapping stopped the moment I swung my legs over the bed. That silence felt heavier than the sound. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. So I stood and walked to the window, expecting to see a raccoon or a branch hanging loose. But when I pulled the curtain aside, the yard looked completely normal. Dim porch light, empty grass, the dark line of trees just past the fence. Then I touched the glass. It was warm. Not just a little warmer than the air. Warm, like someone had held a heating pad against it. I pressed my palm flat against it and felt the warmth radiate inward. It didn't make sense. The temperature outside was in the low 20s, and it wasn't warm everywhere. Only one patch, roughly the height and width of a person's face, maybe a little taller. I pulled my hand away quickly, my fingertips tingling. I leaned closer, squinting through the pane, trying to see if maybe a floodlight from the neighbor's yard was hitting it at an angle. But the warmth didn't spread. It stayed in that single, defined spot. As I stared, the air in the room seemed to thicken. Not visually, just in that way where you feel pressure change without hearing anything. My ears didn't pop, but they felt stuffed, like before a storm. Then something faint shifted outside. A flash. Not light exactly, more like a brief distortion in the air, as if a section of the yard shimmered for half a second and went still again. I stepped back from the window. My chest tightened. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and held it without pulling it open again. After maybe 10 seconds, the tapping returned. But this time it wasn't against the glass. It sounded like it was tapping the house siding beneath the window. Lighter, quicker, tracing a line back and forth. I froze, listening hard, my pulse thudding in my throat. The taps moved upward, one at a time, slow and deliberate, like someone climbing toward the window. I took another step back. The tapping stopped exactly at the height of the warm patch on the glass. I don't know how long I stood there. The whole house felt wrong, too still, too thick, like the air had weight to it. My phone still wouldn't turn on, no matter how long I held the button. The digital clock on the nightstand flickered once, the numbers blurring for a moment, then steadied again. I finally forced myself to look through the window one more time. Nothing. No movement in the yard. No shadows. No animals. The trees were still. The warm area on the glass had faded a little, but was still warmer than the rest by several degrees. I could feel the difference without touching it. A faint sound drifted through the walls, then a low vibrating hum coming from outside. It wasn't mechanical, more like something resonating at a distance, barely audible. The kind of sound you can only hear because the world around you has gone so silent. The hum lasted maybe 3 seconds, rising just slightly in pitch, then cut off. And with it, the warmth vanished. I pressed my palm to the glass again, and now it felt normally cold. The pressure in my ears eased. The air in the room felt real again. My phone vibrated suddenly and lit up with full brightness, making me flinch. It was 2:23 a.m. I clicked it off and waited a few minutes before even thinking about turning lights on. When I finally went outside the next morning, I walked around to look at the siding below the window. Nothing was damaged. No scratches. No dirt smudges. But the snow around that side of the house looked subtly disturbed, like something had pressed down on it lightly in a line pattern, then lifted off without fully stepping. Not footprints. Not paw prints. Just shallow impressions, spaced unevenly, trailing toward the woods. That day, I kept checking the window from inside, running my fingers over the glass to see if any warmth remained. By afternoon, everything was normal temperature, like the whole thing had never happened. That night, I put my phone on the nightstand again, screen facing up. Before sleeping, I checked the time, 11:04. When I woke the next morning, the phone was face down. I never place it face down, and when I flipped it over, there was a notification waiting. Thermal change detected, 2:17 a.m. I tapped it, and the notification disappeared. No app had sent it. There was no history of it. No logs. Nothing. I didn't sleep with the curtains open for weeks. And now, whenever I hear the slightest tick against the house at night, tree branches, settling wood, even the furnace kicking on, I find myself checking the time first. 2:17 a.m. still feels like it's waiting for something. I heard the sound before anything else. A low, steady rhythm coming from somewhere above the tree line, almost like breathing. Not the sharp kind you hear from an animal, but long and drawn out, as if something huge was pulling air in and letting it go. I was standing by the fire ring behind my cabin in northern Maine, part of the woods my uncle used to hunt in before he moved to Florida. The night was cold enough for my breath to fog, but not snowing yet. The fire had burned down to embers, and I was about to turn in. At first, I thought it was wind catching on the ridge behind the trees, but the branches weren't moving, not even a little. Everything was still, like the woods were frozen in a way the weather couldn't explain. The sound came again, slow, almost mechanical in rhythm, but too soft and uneven to be anything man-made. I stood there with my hands tucked under my arms, trying to place it. The woods were usually full of noise, owls, the creek, the occasional rustle of deer, but that night everything felt muted, like I was hearing the world through insulation. I grabbed my flashlight from the patio table and shined it toward the trees. The moment the beam went upward, the breathing-like sound stopped completely. No fade out, just gone. I kept the light steady on the branches, scanning for an owl or something perched up there. Nothing moved. The air felt heavier, almost pressed down. I waited for the sound to start again, but all I heard was my own heartbeat speeding up. I lowered the flashlight, thinking maybe I'd scared off whatever it was. The sound started again, slower this time. I snapped the light upward. Silence. This repeated twice. I lifted and lowered the flashlight like an idiot, testing something I didn't want to be real. Light up. Silence. Light down. Breathing. After the third time, the rhythm changed, shortened into quicker bursts, almost impatient. That was when I went inside and shut the sliding door. I didn't lock it at first, I don't know why, but once I was in the dim warmth of the cabin, the woods suddenly felt too close. I slid the bolt across. The cabin wasn't big. One main room, a small kitchen, a tiny bedroom with a bed barely wider than me. Everything smelled like old cedar and the cheap candles I kept forgetting to throw out. I turned on a couple of lights, but they flickered in a strange way. Not off and on, just dimming briefly like the bulbs were stretching themselves thin. I checked my phone on the counter. No service, which was normal. When I walked past the window above the sink, a faint glow caught my eye. It was subtle, almost bleached looking, seeping between the trees in the far part of the yard. It wasn't moonlight. The moon was a thin sliver and nowhere near that part of the sky, and it wasn't coming from the direction of the nearest town. That was 15 minutes away by car. The glow was still, pale, like someone had hung a soft white sheet behind the tree line and backlit it. I turned off the sink light to cut the glare, leaning closer to the window. The glow didn't brighten or move. It just stayed fixed in place, lighting the shapes of the branches from behind. I grabbed the flashlight again. My hand was shaking enough that I nearly dropped it. I aimed it out the back door window, not opening it this time, and shined it toward the glow. Same thing as before. Silence. The breathing sound cut off instantly. The glow faded slightly, shrinking in on itself. I lowered the flashlight. The sound didn't return, but something else did. A faint rustling, not on the ground, but above, somewhere high in the trees, like something shifting its weight on a wide branch. Too controlled and slow to be a squirrel. Too steady to be the wind. Then the glow moved. Not quickly, not suddenly. It just drifted sideways, like fog sliding through the tree trunks, except fog doesn't move in a straight line and it doesn't keep its shape the way this did. The pale light remained soft and uniform as it slipped deeper into the woods, disappearing behind the thickest part of the tree line. The moment it vanished, the cabin lights flickered again. I backed away from the window, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't panicking exactly, but the quiet was doing something to my nerves. I grabbed my jacket and hat, thinking I might try to sleep, even if sleeping felt impossible. But before I reached the bedroom, something hit the roof. Not a heavy thud, more like a dull tap, followed by a series of dragging noises that circled slowly toward the back of the cabin. I froze mid-step. The dragging continued, an uneven scrape across the shingles, pausing every few seconds like whatever was doing it was adjusting its position. I whispered no, without thinking. The scraping suddenly sped up, crossing the roof toward the far corner. Then it stopped completely. For a full minute, I didn't move. My muscles locked up on their own. I kept waiting for something else, a thump, a shadow, anything, but the roof stayed quiet. I crept to the window nearest the back corner and pushed the curtain aside just enough to peek. I aimed the flashlight upward, but the angle was wrong. The beam caught nothing but branches. The rhythmic breathing returned, but this time it wasn't coming from above the tree line, it was coming from the roof, directly above me. I snapped the flashlight beam upward through the window. Instant silence. The dragging sound began again, crawling toward the opposite end of the roof. I lowered the light slowly, and the dragging softened, then stopped. The breathing didn't return. I backed away from the window, feeling suddenly very small in the middle of the one-room cabin. I sat on the edge of the bed with the flashlight in my lap, trying to listen past the ringing in my ears. The roof stayed silent for several minutes. The woods stayed still. When the sound returned again, it was faint and far away, back where the glow had disappeared earlier. A soft, rhythmic inhale-exhale pattern, low and patient. It felt distant, but not gone. I lay down fully clothed, keeping the flashlight in my hand. Sleep came in short, tense bursts. Every time I drifted off, I startled awake at the slightest noise, the cabin settling, a twig snapping outside, the faint creak of the rafters. Around 4 a.m, the light outside changed. I saw it through the cracks in the blinds first. A subtle brightness moving between the trees again, low and quiet. The rhythm had stopped. Everything was still. I listened for a long time, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. Eventually, the glow faded, retreating into the woods until the darkness looked normal again. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally came up, the cabin felt ordinary. The trees swayed lightly with the morning breeze, like the woods had been asleep all night instead of whatever I had witnessed. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the roof. No damage, no disturbed shingles, nothing out of place. I walked to the clearing where I'd seen the glow. The ground looked untouched. No footprints, no broken branches. The wind moved normally now, rustling the leaves, carrying the usual smell of pine and cold earth. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before and drove back to town without looking in the rear view more than necessary. That night, in my apartment hours away from the cabin, I tried to sleep again. Just before drifting off, I thought I heard a low rhythmic sound, barely audible, almost imagined, coming from somewhere above the building. I turned on the light. The sound stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I went solo camping last October up in the Klamath National Forest, not far from the Oregon border. It's one of those places where you can hike for hours without seeing another person, which was kind of the point. I'd been feeling burned out and just needed to be completely away from everything for a couple days. No signal, no emails, no traffic. I parked my car off a Forest Service road and hiked in about 3 miles with my pack and gear. Found a small clearing not far from a creek. Perfect spot. Quiet, remote, way off any trail. First night was uneventful. Chilly but clear, not too windy. I made a small fire, cooked some freeze-dried stuff, listened to some music through a little solar-powered speaker, then packed it in early. I remember falling asleep faster than usual, just totally worn out from the hike and the air. Then came the second night. It had been overcast most of the afternoon, and by sundown it had dropped to the low 40s. I bundled up, skipped the fire, and climbed into my sleeping bag around 9:30. I remember checking my watch. Slept for a while, I think. Probably a few hours. Then something woke me up. It wasn't a sound at first. It was more like pressure, like when you're asleep on a plane and you wake up right as it changes altitude. My ears didn't pop, but I had that same weird awareness in my chest and head. The kind that pulls you up out of deep sleep. The tent was lit up, not like flashlight under the fabric lit up. It was even, pale, not coming from a beam or a single spot. The whole tent was glowing faintly from the outside. Not enough to see clearly inside, but just enough to make everything slightly visible. My boots, the zipper seams, the outline of my backpack. At first I thought it was the moon breaking through the clouds, but I sat up and looked through the mesh screen at the top. No moon, just dark clouds. And the light didn't shift like moonlight does. It stayed the same brightness the whole time. Then I heard the sound. Low. A hum, but not like an engine or a generator. More like when you're standing under high-tension wires, that faint electric buzz you can't quite place. Except there were no power lines out there, not even close. Closest building was probably 20 miles away. It wasn't close at first. It felt distant, not directional, just present, like it was woven into the air somehow. I didn't move for a while, just sat there inside the bag trying to listen. Every now and then it would swell, not louder exactly, but heavier, like the air got thicker when it pulsed. At some point, I reached for my phone out of habit. Dead. Not low battery, totally black. Wouldn't power on. I checked my lantern next. It blinked once when I turned it on, then nothing. I had a backup headlamp, and that one worked, but the beam looked off, dimmer than usual, like it was pushing against something. The light outside the tent never changed. Still soft, still even, like someone had set up a giant frosted panel a few feet away. No shadows, no flickers. Just this pale, impossible glow. I heard one twig snap, not close, maybe 20 yards away, but that was it. No footsteps, no animals, no wind. After about 15 minutes, I unzipped the flap just enough to look outside. I don't know how to describe what I saw. The light wasn't coming from a source I could see. It was just there, hanging in the clearing like fog, but not moving. And not white, either. Kind of bluish, like a welding arc, but softer. The trees around the clearing were lit too, but the tops disappeared into the dark, like the glow didn't reach more than 10 feet off the ground. I didn't see anyone. Or anything. Just stillness. The hum was louder now, but still muffled, like hearing it underwater. My ears felt full. I realized my chest was tight, and I'd been holding my breath without noticing. I stayed like that for a while, crouched by the flap, peeking out. Nothing changed. No movement. No wind. Just that sound and the light. And then at some point, everything stopped. I don't remember it going away gradually. 1 second it was there, then it wasn't. The hum dropped out mid-pulse, not like someone yanked the plug. The glow vanished instantly, not faded, not blinked, just off. Total darkness. Crickets started up again, distant wind through the trees. I sat there in the sudden silence, blinking, trying to adjust. Eventually I laid back down. I didn't sleep, not really, just kind of drifted in and out until dawn. When I unzipped the tent and stepped out in the morning, everything looked normal. Slight dew on the grass, sky was clearing, nothing burned, no weird tracks, no flattened grass. But my car, which I'd parked maybe 100 feet up the hill on a patch of gravel, wouldn't start. Completely dead. Battery was maybe a year old. No lights had been left on. I popped the hood and checked the terminals. Nothing looked loose. I tried the key again, not even a click. My phone powered on around 10 a.m. Battery was at 87%. I hadn't plugged it in since arriving. Eventually, a guy in a pickup came down the service road around noon. I flagged him down and he gave me a jump. The engine caught after a few seconds. No warning lights. Everything back to normal. I didn't camp the third night, packed up and left. Never went back to that spot. I was 9 when it happened. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, not even my older brother who I shared the room with. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. He was 12 and already in that stage where everything was dumb or boring unless it had explosions or a skateboard in it. It was late June. We lived in a one-story ranch house in northern Minnesota on the edge of a neighborhood that sort of faded into woods. My room faced the backyard, which ran into a bunch of trees, then a steep hill that dropped off toward the creek. We had a short chain link fence, but it didn't cover the whole yard, just a section around where my mom had planted some flowers. That night I was still awake because it was summer and I didn't have to be anywhere, and because I'd snuck a flashlight under my pillow so I could keep reading a Goosebumps Bumps book after lights out. My brother had passed out around 10 like usual. He always slept like a brick. I was reading, curled up on my side with the flashlight propped under my blanket when I noticed something weird. The light in the room shifted, even though everything was off. It was subtle at first. I thought maybe it was a car turning around or someone's motion sensor light in the yard next door, but it didn't flicker like headlights. It was steady, pale, almost gray-blue. I turned off the flashlight and lifted the blanket to look. The whole wall across from me, the one with the window, was glowing faintly. Not bright enough to light up the room completely, just enough that I could make out shapes. My dresser, the edges of the closet door, the lump of my brother in his bed. I sat up slowly. The glow was coming from the window, through the curtains. We had those thick cotton curtains with little stars printed on them, navy blue with yellow stitching. They didn't sway much, even if you opened a window. That's why it freaked me out when I saw them move. Just a little, like someone had brushed them with their fingers from the other side. I froze, thinking maybe it was the fan. But we didn't have one in that window. The window was shut, I was sure of it. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, not because I was worried about waking my brother, but because I suddenly had the thought that something might hear me. I didn't go all the way to the window. Just stood a few feet back and listened. There was no noise, no bugs, which was weird. Summer nights around there usually buzzed like crazy. I remember that part clearly. It was silent, like the house had been dropped under glass. The curtains shifted again, not a full swing, just a little ripple, like the air behind them had changed. I remember backing up and pressing my legs against my bed frame. Then the light outside started to move, not side to side, just down. It faded slowly, like it was sinking behind the hill. The glow in the room softened, then disappeared altogether. A second later, I could hear the bugs again. Crickets and that high whine from the woods, like someone had hit play on the world. I didn't go to the window that night. I just got back into bed and pulled the blanket up to my chin and stared at the ceiling until the sky started to lighten. My brother didn't stir once. In the morning, I went to the window first thing. Not because I expected to see anything, really. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The screen was bent outward. Not the frame, just the mesh itself, like someone had pushed at it from the inside. One of the bottom corners was pulled away from the track. The lock on the window was still latched. I opened it and leaned out. The mulch under the window didn't look disturbed. No footprints, no trampled flowers. But the screen didn't make sense. It was pushed out like someone had leaned hard on it trying to get out. My brother came in behind me while I was still standing there and asked what I was doing. I told him the screen was messed up, and he said it was probably a raccoon or something. I didn't argue. I bent the screen back into place best I could. It never quite fit right after that. There was always a gap in the corner that let spiders in. That day, I checked all the other windows in the house. None of their screens were messed up, just mine. I didn't sleep much for the rest of that summer. Every night I thought about closing the curtains tighter or shoving a chair under the doorknob, but I never did. I just stayed very still, listening. Nothing ever happened again. At least, not like that. But I always wondered, if the window had been unlocked, what would have happened? It happened last October out on Highway 2 in Washington, just east of Gold Bar. I was heading back from visiting my sister in Leavenworth. She was in the hospital for a couple of days, nothing life-threatening, just complications from a surgery. I stayed longer than I planned, so I ended up driving home late, around 10:30 p.m. when I left. The road's mostly two-lane through that stretch. Trees on both sides, big evergreens that crowd up against the shoulders. No real towns between there and Monroe, just a few gas stations and some scattered cabins if you know where to look. I was maybe 40 minutes into the drive. It was dry and cold, sky clear, not much traffic. I was sipping coffee from a gas station cup, cruising steady around 55. No music, just the low hum of the tires on the pavement. Then I noticed something weird in the passenger side window. Not in the mirror. This was in the actual glass, like a reflection from the inside. There was this soft, round light, pale blue or white, kind of like the color of a computer screen in the dark. It wasn't bright enough to light up the cab or anything, but it was clearly there, just hovering near the edge of the glass. And the thing was, there was nothing behind me that could have made it. The road had been empty for miles. No cars in front, none behind. I even glanced at the rear view and confirmed it. Totally dark. The tree line on both sides was too close to reflect anything, and there weren't any buildings out there. So I turned my head. Just a quick look behind, over my shoulder. Nothing. No light source, no sign of movement, just darkness. But when I looked back at the window, the reflection was still there. That stopped me cold. I tapped the brakes, not hard, just enough to slow down a little, and stared straight into the glass. The light hadn't moved. It looked like it was hanging just behind the car, maybe 4 or 5 feet up and off to the right, but I couldn't see it outside. Only in the reflection. That really messed with my head. I rolled the window down. Cold air came in. The reflection vanished. Rolled it back up. Nothing. It didn't come back. I kept driving. Heart was picking up a bit, but I didn't want to admit I was spooked. Figured maybe some odd glare from my phone screen or the instrument panel, even though I'd had both dimmed. A few minutes later, I passed under a little bridge, one of those single-lane logging access things. After that, the trees opened up a bit on the left side, and I glanced out over the road shoulder. And I swear I saw something there. Not directly, but out of the corner of my eye, just above the tree line. It looked like a shape against the stars, not blocking them out exactly, more like bending them. Like the way heat shimmers over pavement. There was no sound, no movement, just this faint distortion in the sky. I stared at it for a couple seconds, trying to decide if it was even real. Then, it was gone. Just like that. About 10 miles later, I pulled off at a turnout to collect myself. Checked my phone, had a couple texts from my sister's husband, time-stamped about 20 minutes ago. I didn't remember the phone buzzing or lighting up. What's weird is, when I checked the messages, the signal was gone. 0 bars. I tried refreshing a weather app just to check. It spun for a second and froze. I got out of the car, just needing some air, and leaned on the hood. The forest around me was dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, no engine noise from the road. Not even the usual high-up hum from the power lines that run through that area. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard it. This faint whirring sound. Mechanical, kind of soft. Not quite like a drone and not quite like a motor. It didn't come from one direction. It felt like it was above, somewhere high, but spread out, like it was part of the air itself. It lasted about 10 seconds, then faded out. I looked up, trying to spot anything in the sky, but there was nothing, just stars, perfectly clear. When I got back in the car, I noticed the dashboard clock was blinking. That was the first time I got genuinely uneasy. I hadn't turned the car off. My headlights were still on, but the clock was blinking like the battery had reset. Same with the radio. It had dumped my presets. Everything was back to default. I turned the ignition off, then on again. The car started fine, but now the clock said 12. It had been around 11 when I stopped. I checked my phone again. It said 11:42, which didn't make sense. I hadn't been sitting there for over 40 minutes. There's no way. I got back on the road, going faster than before. Made it to Monroe in about 20 minutes, pulled into a Shell station, and just sat there under the lights for a while. I didn't get out. Didn't buy anything. Just sat, letting the normalcy soak back in. Eventually, I drove the rest of the way home. Nothing else happened. Next morning, I checked the car's system again. Presets were gone. Bluetooth settings wiped, like it had never been paired with my phone. The strangest part, though, my rear passenger window, there was a faint smudge on the outside glass. Perfectly circular, maybe the size of a grapefruit. Not dirt, not a handprint. More like a residue, barely visible unless you caught it in the right light. I cleaned it off and didn't say anything to anyone. I don't know what that was. That drive dozens of times, both directions. Never had anything like that happen before or since. But sometimes when I'm out there again, I'll glance at the windows a little more than usual, just to check. It was a Tuesday night, or technically early Wednesday morning, sometime last April. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, which wasn't unusual. I do that a lot when I tell myself I'm just gonna rest my eyes after dinner. The TV was still on, volume low, playing reruns of some home renovation show. I woke up kind of abruptly, not from a dream or anything. It was just that sudden awareness where your body knows something's different. The apartment was quiet, no cars outside, no hum from the fridge, nothing. That stuck out because I live near a freeway in West Sacramento. There's always something buzzing or humming or passing by, but it was just still. I rubbed my face, sat up a bit, and realized the blinds behind me were glowing. Not like sunlight, not like headlights either. It was faint but steady, pale, kind of bluish white, like the color of a phone screen turned way down in a dark room. It wasn't bright enough to light up the whole place, but enough that the slats of the blinds were clearly outlined on the opposite wall, even though it was well past midnight. I assumed at first it was just a weird passing car with bright LEDs, maybe someone parked with their brights pointed at the building. I live on the second floor though, so that didn't really add up. I turned and looked toward the window, but something weird happened when I tried to focus through the slats. My eyes wouldn't adjust. The glow faded slowly, not like something moved away, but like the light had never really been there at all. It just sort of thinned out until I was left staring at normal darkness. But my eyes kept straining, like they were coming off a camera flash, except I hadn't seen anything directly. My pupils felt slow to respond. Everything in the apartment looked oddly dim, even with the TV still on. I got up and pulled the blinds open all the way. The sky was completely clear. No clouds, no haze, nothing blocking the stars. But even though I could see the stars, something felt wrong about them. They weren't as sharp as usual, like I was looking through a layer of distortion, even though my window was clean. I leaned closer and opened the window itself just to be sure. The air was cool, normal, nothing smelled off. That's when I noticed the neighbors' wind chimes weren't moving. They hang from a little awning on the building across the lot, and normally they're always tinkling, even just a little. But they were dead still, like the air wasn't moving at all. I stuck my head out farther to get a look around the complex. Everything was dark. Not a single porch light on, not even the usual dull yellow from the laundry room window downstairs. Just darkness and this weird, faint, shimmering quality in the air. Almost like heat waves, but it was maybe 53 degrees out. Then I saw the porch light across from me blink once. Fast, like a camera flash, and then nothing. Just a quick pulse. No sound with it. I closed the window and walked through the apartment, turning on a couple lights. They came on, but they looked off. Like they were dimmer than usual or tinted slightly. I opened the fridge just to check, and even the light in there seemed strange. Not burnt out, just weaker somehow. I checked my phone. It was on, battery around 60%. No alerts, no missed calls. I opened the camera and tried pointing it out the window. The screen stayed black, even though I was clearly pointing it at a lit-up street. I turned it to face inside, and it worked fine. The second I pointed it out again, just black. Then it froze. Not the whole phone, just the camera app. The button stopped responding. The image was stuck. I tried to close it and open it again. Same result. I shut the phone off and just stood in the middle of the living room. The silence was thick now. Not just no noise. It felt like there should be noise, but something was suppressing it, like being underwater. About a minute later, I heard something very faint. A low, pulsing hum. Not loud, not even consistent. Just there, like it was happening just at the edge of hearing. I pressed my ear to the wall to see if it was coming from the neighbor's apartment, but it didn't change. It didn't get louder or shift direction. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I turned off all the lights again. I don't really know why. I think I felt exposed. Even though my blinds were closed again, I didn't want any light coming out. I sat back down on the couch and tried to focus on the TV, but the screen looked off too. The colors were muted, and the sound had a slight delay, like it was running half a second behind. Suddenly, every hair on my arm stood up. You know that feeling when someone walks into a room behind you, even if they're completely silent? That was what it felt like, except it wasn't inside the apartment. It was just outside the window. No footsteps, no shadows, just the unmistakable sense that something was there, just beyond the glass. I didn't look right away. I stayed completely still. My heart was going nuts, and I was trying to convince myself it was nothing. A raccoon, a drunk neighbor, a trick of the light. Then I heard the softest thud, like a single footstep. Not on the balcony, on the wall, as if something had landed lightly on the outside and pressed against it. I finally turned my head and looked. There was nothing, no movement, no shadow, just the same dark street and distant lights of the highway beyond. But again, it took my eyes longer than it should have to adjust, like the sky was darker than it had any right to be. The hum came back, a little stronger now, and this time, I felt it in my chest, like a deep bass note. Not painful, but unnerving. It only lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded out like it had been turned off. Immediately after, the porch lights across the complex flicked on all at once, every single one. Then, within 3 seconds, they turned off again. Just one pulse of artificial daylight, then gone. My phone restarted by itself. The logo came up. It stayed on that screen for a while, longer than usual. When it finally booted up, it asked me to re-enter my passcode instead of using my fingerprint. My home screen was intact. No apps missing, no weird messages. But the clock was wrong. It said 3:22 a.m. That didn't make sense. I'd woken up just after 2:50. I was sure of it. I hadn't been sitting there for 30 minutes. Maybe 10, tops. Everything felt like it had clicked back into place. The sounds outside returned gradually. The distant traffic, a dog barking 2 blocks over, the wind chimes. Even the fridge motor kicked in again. I sat there until sunrise, not really thinking, just watching the sky. It looked normal by then. Pale blue creeping in from the east. No distortion, no glow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed over, or maybe stayed just long enough to notice me noticing it. I didn't notice the audio file until almost noon the next day. I'd been working from home, half distracted, going through emails on my laptop when I got a notification from my phone that storage was running low. I tapped into it, thinking I'd just delete a few videos or clear out the downloads folder, but there was this one file near the top of the list I didn't recognize. Audio 0014.m4a, 14 seconds long, created at 3:12 a.m. That caught my attention right away because I hadn't been awake at that time. I don't have any kind of sleep recording app, never installed anything like that. I checked again to see if it was a leftover file from something else, maybe a voice memo from work, or something I'd accidentally recorded earlier in the day. But the timestamp was specific, 3:12 a.m. that night. It wasn't labeled by an app, just a raw audio file in the internal recordings folder, which I never use. I put on headphones and hit play. For the first few seconds, it was mostly static. Not loud, more like distant white noise. There were faint background hisses and pops, almost like an old analog recording, except I don't own anything that would make that kind of sound. Then about 4 seconds in, there was a click. Then another, soft, not mechanical, not like a switch, more organic, like 2 wet fingernails tapping together, if that makes any sense. Click, 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 perfectly spaced, a short pause, then the pattern again. Maybe 5 or 6 in total before it stopped. then just more static until the file ended. I played it 3 times thinking maybe I was hearing it wrong. The rhythm didn't change. It wasn't interference. It felt intentional. I didn't sleep well the night before, but I hadn't thought much of it. I'd gone to bed around 11:30 and woke up groggy at 7. I do remember waking up once in the dark and checking the time on my phone. It was just after 3 a.m., I think. I had this vague sense that something had stirred me, but there wasn't any noise. Just that off feeling you get sometimes, like something had just stopped. I live alone in a duplex outside Flagstaff. One story, nothing fancy, tucked up against the backside of a hill. My bedroom's at the back of the house, no windows facing the street, just one small one that looks out toward a patch of scrub pine and the slope beyond. I keep my phone on the nightstand. It's always in do not disturb mode overnight with no voice assistant, nothing that should be listening for commands. And like I said, I don't use sleep apps. I checked battery history. Nothing showed as active at that time. No media apps, no system log of anything happening around 3:12 a.m., just the file. I thought maybe I'd rolled over and hit the screen somehow. But even then, how would the recording app have opened? I tested it. It took 3 taps just to get to it, and the file name it saved didn't match how the native voice recorder usually labels things. I don't know why, but the clicking stuck in my head all day. I kept hearing it in the back of my thoughts. Not loud, just there. I finally told myself it must have been a glitch or something from outside, maybe a raccoon or a branch tapping the side of the house. That night, before I went to bed, I opened the window a crack just to see if anything outside could be making that sound. I stood there in the dark for a minute. Nothing. Just a few crickets, the wind through the trees. No clicks. I turned off the light and got into bed. I charged the phone in the exact same place on the nightstand. When I woke up the next morning, there was another file, audio 1/5.m4a. 3 a.m. I didn't play it right away. I stared at the file name for a while. Just the fact that it was there made my stomach tighten. Same size. 14 seconds. Eventually I put on the headphones. Same static, same faint background hiss. Then the clicking, but it was closer this time. Louder, still soft but more pronounced. Same rhythm. Click, click, click. And right at the end there was a pause. Then one final click, louder than the rest, almost sharp, then silence. I pulled the headphones off. I didn't sleep the following night. I left the bedroom light on. I kept the phone unplugged. I deleted the previous files, put the phone in airplane mode, closed every app, powered it off completely. When I woke up, it was back on. Battery at 74%. Last activity 3:09 a.m., and there was a new file, audio 06.m4a. 14 seconds. I didn't listen to that one right away either. I sat in the kitchen for half an hour just staring at the screen. Then I played it. The static was lighter this time, almost silent, and there were no clicks. Not right away. There was just breathing. Faint, ragged, like someone standing just far enough from the mic to barely register. A long exhale, then another. Then the clicking started. One click, another, then nothing. The file cut off before the 14-second mark. Just ended mid-hiss. That was the day I called my sister. I didn't say everything, just told her I'd been hearing weird things at night, and I wasn't sleeping well. She offered to let me stay over, but I brushed it off. Told her I was probably just stressed. I went for a long drive that afternoon, just to clear my head. I left my phone on the passenger seat the whole time, screen facing down. When I got home around 5 p.m., there was a new notification. The voice recorder had tried to launch itself at 3:11 p.m. while I was driving, while the phone was locked and untouched. No file this time, just the attempt. That night, I left the phone in the kitchen. I shut the bedroom door and turned on a white noise machine, put my watch in airplane mode, powered everything else off. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. fully alert. Not panicked, just awake. I couldn't hear anything. The house felt quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I sat up, not moving, just listening. There were no clicks, no breathing, no sounds at all. I stayed that way for a while. Then finally I got up and walked out to the kitchen. The phone was on. New file, audio 0017.m4a. This one was 14 seconds like the others. Timestamp 3:12 a.m. I took a breath, sat down at the table, and played it. No static this time, just one sound, repeating, very slow, very clear. It was the sound of my bedroom door opening. Hinge creak, light wooden shift, a faint click as it swung. Then, nothing. The door had been closed when I woke up. I'm sure of that. I don't know how the phone recorded it. I don't know what's been triggering it. I checked for malware, factory reset the whole device, wiped everything. I started sleeping with the phone off and sealed in a drawer. No new recordings since then. But sometimes, just after 3 a.m., I wake up anyway and lie there, listening. I live in a one-story ranch house just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, near the bottom of a ridge. Not in the middle of nowhere exactly, but far enough out that I don't hear traffic. The nearest neighbors are about a quarter-mile up the hill. A lot of trees, no streetlights. My house has one of those long, low-pitched roofs and a skylight over the hallway, one of the plastic dome ones that turns bright during the day but doesn't really give you a clear view of the sky. This happened back in early March. I remember that because it had rained for 3 days straight, and this was the first dry night, still cold out. I cracked a window in the kitchen to get some of the musty air out, then turned in early around 10:30. I don't usually have trouble sleeping, but I woke up sometime in the night. No reason that I could point to. Just one of those sudden, wide-awake moments where you feel like something's off but can't say what. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much sound there usually is, even at night. No heater clicking, no fridge humming. I didn't hear wind or any of the usual creaks from the rafters. Just stillness. Then I heard it. A sound on the roof. Not sharp, not like branches or squirrels. It was heavy, slow, like something dragging across the shingles, starting above the living room and moving toward the bedroom. A low grinding shuffle, not loud, but deep, like it had weight. I sat up in bed, heart already pounding. I remember thinking, there's no way that's an animal. It didn't move like one. Too deliberate. Too slow. Then the sound stopped. I waited. Didn't move. I figured maybe it was an echo from something outside, maybe a tree falling way off. But it hadn't sounded distant. It sounded like it was right there, overhead. A few seconds passed, and then the light started, not from a window, from the skylight. It began as a faint glow, pale and white blue, like the moon filtered through fog. But it brightened, just a little, and lit the hallway like a soft bulb had been switched on. There are no outside lights near the skylight, no security floods or neighbors close enough to shine anything through. The glow lasted maybe 5 seconds, long enough for me to stand up and walk halfway to the door, barefoot on the cold floor. And then, nothing. No footsteps. No more sound. The light faded out as quickly as it had come. The house stayed silent. I stood there for another minute, listening. I didn't hear anything else. No retreating steps, no engines, no voices. Just that same oppressive quiet, the kind that makes you second-guess your breathing. I walked into the hallway, looked up at the skylight. I couldn't see anything. Just black. I didn't know if it was cloudy or if something had actually been there, blocking it. Eventually, I went back to bed. Not because I felt safe, but because there wasn't anything else to do. I didn't feel tired, but I guess I must have drifted off at some point. Next thing I knew, the light outside the windows was full daylight. I rolled over and looked at the clock, 8:23. I was supposed to be up at 6:30. My alarm hadn't gone off. I reached for my phone. It was still plugged in, battery at 98%. Alarm app was open. The alarm had been set. It just never triggered. I checked the hallway again. Skylight looked normal. No condensation, no marks, nothing. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the house, looking for anything. No broken branches, no footprints in the soft dirt, no signs that anything heavy had been up there. But the odd part was that the car windshield had some kind of faint residue on it, almost like dust, but with a very fine shimmer. I wiped it off and it smeared slightly, like dry powder. That same day, my microwave clock was blinking like the power had gone out. I hadn't noticed it before. Nothing else had reset. Oven clock was fine, internet router was working, only the microwave. I thought about getting up there and checking the roof, but I don't have a ladder long enough to reach it safely. And after a while, I convinced myself there wouldn't be anything to find anyway. But I still think about the sound, that slow, deliberate movement, like something not in a hurry. Like it knew I could hear it, and I still wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the front door. I lived in a second floor apartment over a dentist's office, the kind of place that always smelled faintly like mint and disinfectant when the vents kicked on. That night had been quiet. No sirens, no loud neighbors, just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and rain tapping against the window unit. I went to bed around 11:30. I remembered checking my phone. 2 unread emails, 1 text from my sister about our mom's birthday. Normal stuff. I plugged it in on the nightstand and turned onto my side. The rain got heavier for a while, then slowed to a soft, steady patter. I fell asleep pretty fast. I woke up at some point in the night because the room felt wrong. That was the first clear thought I had. Not loud, not scary yet, just wrong. There was light in the room. Not from outside, my blinds were the cheap plastic kind that blocked most of the streetlight glow. This was different. It was soft but filled the whole space, like someone had turned on a lamp with a thick white shade. I could see the outline of my dresser, the laundry chair in the corner, the door. Everything looked washed out, like the contrast had been turned down. I tried to lift my head, and that was when I realized I couldn't. It wasn't like being held down. It felt more like my body was too heavy to move, like gravity had quietly doubled. I tried wiggling my fingers first. Nothing. My arms felt like they were buried under sand. My chest moved, so I knew I was breathing, but even that felt slow, like my lungs were working through syrup. I wasn't panicking yet. I remember thinking, oh, this is that thing, sleep paralysis. I'd read about it before. Your brain wakes up before your body does. People see stuff. That explanation felt solid for maybe 10 seconds. Then I noticed the sound, a low hum. Not loud, but steady. It didn't come from one direction. It felt like it was just there, in the air. It reminded me of standing near a big electrical transformer, that faint buzzing you feel more than hear. My eyes were open, and I could move them a little. I looked toward the window. The blinds were glowing. Not bright beams coming through the slats, more like the plastic itself was lit up from behind, evenly. I tried to swallow and couldn't. My mouth was dry. My heart started to beat harder, and I could hear it in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was a dream layered on top of being half awake. That still made sense. Mostly. Then the light shifted. It didn't flicker. It didn't get brighter. It sort of tightened, like the room had been filled with foggy light, and now that fog was slowly pulling toward the center of the ceiling. The corners of the room got darker, while the space above my bed stayed bright. I wanted to turn my head to look straight up, but my neck wouldn't cooperate. My eyes strained, and I caught just the edge of something in the upper part of my vision. Not a shape exactly, more like a place where the light looked thicker, like heat shimmer over asphalt. The hum got slightly louder. Still not loud enough to hurt, just present. I had this strong, stupid thought that my upstairs neighbor had put some kind of machine on the floor and it was shining through the ceiling. That didn't make sense, and even in that moment I knew it, but my brain kept reaching for normal explanations and coming up short. My phone screen lit up on the nightstand. I couldn't turn my head enough to see the whole thing, but I saw the glow. Blue-white, sharper than the rest of the light. It stayed on way longer than a normal notification. Long enough that I started counting in my head. I got to 27 before it went dark again. The heavy feeling in my body got worse for a second, like I was sinking deeper into the mattress. My ears popped, like when you go up a hill too fast. The hum dipped lower, almost like it was winding down. And then everything just stopped. The light didn't snap off. It faded, smooth and slow, until the room was dark again, except for the faint orange glow from the smoke detector. The hum thinned out and disappeared. The weight on my body lifted in a rush, like someone had pulled a blanket off me. I sucked in a huge breath and rolled onto my back, arms jerking like they belonged to someone else. My heart was pounding so hard my chest hurt. The room looked normal. Dark, quiet. Rain still tapping at the window. I grabbed my phone with shaky fingers. The screen said 2:43 a.m. There were no new notifications. I opened my messages, my email, everything. Nothing new since before I went to sleep. No missed calls, no weird alarms set. I even checked the flashlight app because I had this dumb idea maybe I'd turned it on somehow. It wasn't running. I got up and turned on the bedside lamp. Warm yellow light filled the room. Totally normal. I checked the window. The blinds were in place, no gaps. Outside was just a wet parking lot and the street light across the road. I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and stood there staring at myself in the mirror. I looked pale, eyes wide, hair smashed on one side. I kept expecting to see something off, marks, redness, anything. There was nothing. Back in bed, I left the lamp on. I didn't care about sleep anymore, but I must have drifted off anyway. My alarm went off at 7. For a second, I thought the whole thing had been a dream. Morning light came through the edges of the blinds, gray and rainy. My room looked small and ordinary again. The lamp was still on. Then I noticed my phone battery. It was at 12%. I always charged it overnight, and I hadn't touched it after plugging it in. The charging cable was still connected, but it was loose at the wall. Not unplugged, just not fully pushed in. Enough that it hadn't been charging. I didn't remember touching it. I checked my screen time out of habit. It showed over 3 hours of active use between 2 and 5 a.m., most of it listed under home and lock screen. No apps open, just the screen on. I stood there in my pajamas, phone in hand, trying to replay the night. I remembered waking up with the light. I remembered grabbing my phone at 2:43. After that, nothing until the alarm. I told myself I must have been half asleep, messing with it without remembering. That made more sense than anything else. In the kitchen, I poured cereal and noticed the microwave clock. It said 6:17. The stove clock said 7:12. I knew there had been a power flicker earlier in the week, but I'd reset both. I was sure of it. Now they were both wrong, and wrong in different ways. I reset them again, hands moving automatically. My apartment felt slightly off, like after you move furniture and can't remember how it looked before. When I left for work, my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, was out front under the awning, smoking. She squinted at me and said, "Power went out last night for a bit. You lose anything?" I paused halfway down the steps. "I don't think so." "What time?" "Little after 2, maybe?" My TV shut off, came back on by itself. I nodded like that was useful information, like it explained anything. At my car, I unlocked it and stopped. The passenger seat was reclined all the way back. I never touched that seat. No one rode with me. I stood there in the drizzle, keys in my hand, trying to remember the last time I even opened that door. I couldn't. I leaned in and pushed the seat upright again. The fabric felt slightly damp, like it had been left near an open window, even though everything was closed. I drove to work in a fog, not sleepy exactly, just detached. Every time I stopped at a red light, I glanced up at the sky without meaning to. It was low and gray, clouds hanging heavy over the highway. That night, when I went to bed again, I didn't plug my phone into the wall. I set it face down on the dresser across the room. I lay there in the dark, listening to the building creak and the pipes knock. Every little glow made my stomach tighten. Car headlights passing, the LED on the smoke detector. I didn't sleep much, but nothing happened. Still, every time I wake up in the middle of the night now, I check the room before I move. I listen for that low hum, that pressure in the air. Sometimes I think I almost hear it, right at the edge of everything else. I woke up to the sound of the wind chimes on my balcony, the soft kind of clinking they make when a breeze pushes through. It took me a second to register it because my apartment in Flagstaff never got much wind at night, especially not in early September when the air sat still and warm. I waited for another gust, ready to fall back asleep, but the chimes kept moving even though nothing else did. No shifting trees, no rattling blinds, nothing. Then the sound cut off all at once, like someone grabbed the chimes with their hand. The silence that followed felt strange, heavier than the usual quiet of my street. I sat up, listening. No cars in the distance, no neighbor's TV bleeding through the wall, even the hum from the old fridge felt muted. It was like the whole apartment complex had taken a breath and held it. I checked my phone, 2:17 a.m. I swung my legs off the bed and walked to the sliding door. The blinds were closed, but a faint light pressed through the gaps. Not bright, not any color I could name. More like the glow from a computer screen through a curtain. I pushed one slat down with my finger and looked outside. The balcony was empty. The chimes hung still. The light didn't seem to come from anywhere specific. It just existed around the space. Not a beam, not a reflection. Just a soft haze sitting in the air, and the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't lighting the balcony so much as tinting it. I opened the door an inch to listen. The air outside felt warm and thick, like the moment before a monsoon storm, but the sky was totally clear. The neighborhood below, a small row of apartment buildings and a few storage units, looked normal, except the shadows seemed slightly off. Not stretched, not moved, just shaped wrong. I stepped out far enough to touch the chimes. They were still swaying lightly, even though I didn't feel any wind. When I grabbed them, the motion stopped, but the light didn't change. It stayed fixed, almost patient. I went back inside and closed the door. I remember thinking maybe there was a new construction light somewhere down the street, something the city had installed without notice. But the light didn't behave like any normal source. It didn't flicker, it didn't brighten or dim. It had no direction. I tried to shake it off and went to the kitchen for water. When I flicked the switch, the lights took a full second to come on. Not a normal slow start, more like something delayed them. Same with the faucet. The water sputtered at first, then came out normally. All these tiny things I would have brushed off during the day felt huge and out of place at that hour. As I lifted the glass to sip, the chimes sounded again. One soft clink. Then silence. I froze with the glass halfway up. I knew I hadn't opened the balcony door again, so nothing should have moved them. I didn't hear footsteps or voices or animals, just that single tap of metal hitting metal in a dead still night. I walked back to the sliding door and pushed the blinds aside, fully this time. The light was gone. The balcony looked like it always did. Cheap concrete, a folding chair, a potted cactus I kept forgetting to water. The streetlights below flickered the way they usually did. Everything seemed normal, except the quiet still felt wrong, like the world hadn't fully restarted after something paused it. I checked the sky. No glow, no plane, no clouds. I locked the door and went back to bed, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing just outside on the balcony. Not watching, but waiting. It was a pressure I couldn't explain. I rolled over to face the wall and tried to ignore it. At some point, I drifted off. When I woke again, it was 3:41 a.m. and the room felt colder than it should have. Not freezing, just wrong for early September. I sat up, rubbing my arms. The apartment heater hadn't turned on, so the temperature drop made no sense. Then I noticed a faint glow under the bedroom door. Not the overhead light, not the hallway bulb. This glow was low, close to the floor, and it pulsed very slowly, like something breathing. I stepped toward it and pressed my ear to the door. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no movement, just that thick silence again, like sound itself couldn't get in. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The glow came from the living room window, which faced the parking lot. It wasn't the same color as before. This one was more gray than blue, but still not a shade I'd seen lights make. It filled the room without bouncing off anything. The shadows didn't shift or stretch. They just sat there. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the window. I felt drawn in a weird way, not pulled but nudged. When I got close enough to see outside, the glow vanished, leaving the room dark except for the faint orange street lamps. I scanned the lot. A few cars, a couple empty spaces, the dumpster at the far end. Nothing moved. Then I noticed something odd. The car alarms. Every car had its little red dashboard light blinking in sync. Not fast, not slow, just perfectly together, like someone timed them all to match. I watched for maybe 10 seconds before the lights all froze mid-blink. Every single one. Then they resumed blinking, but out of sync again, like normal. I stepped back from the window so quickly I hit the counter behind me. My heart was pounding. I didn't know what any of it meant, but I didn't want to witness the next thing, whatever it was. I sat on the couch with every light on, scrolling through my phone even though I wasn't reading anything. The silence pressed in again, heavier this time. I kept listening for any sound that proved the world was still moving. A passing car, a humming AC unit, anything. Eventually around 4:20 I heard something. A soft scraping on the balcony. Slow, uneven, like someone dragging a foot or brushing their hand along the concrete. I walked to the sliding door, staying to the side so I wouldn't be visible if someone was out there. The scraping stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then the chimes tapped once. Just once. I didn't open the door. I didn't look. I backed away and sat against the far wall until the first hint of sunrise. The second the light outside turned from black to gray, the pressure in the apartment lifted. The silence broke. I heard a bird, a car door, someone's shower turning on next door. It felt like everything snapped back into place. When I finally stepped onto the balcony, the chimes hung perfectly still. The cactus was untouched. The concrete looked normal except for one thing, a small patch near the railing that felt slightly warmer than the rest, like someone had been standing there. No footprints, no marks, just warmth on a cool morning. I stayed out there for a minute, listening for anything out of place. The world sounded loud again. Traffic, birds, people leaving for work. All normal. I went inside, took a long shower, and tried to tell myself I'd imagined most of it. But even now, months later, the wind chimes sometimes ring in that same gentle pattern, always at night, always when the air is completely still. And every time it happens, that heavy silence settles in for a moment before everything goes back to normal. I was sitting by Lake Sundown the night it happened. The name makes it sound dramatic, but it's just a small lake outside Carlton, Minnesota, quiet, surrounded by pines, the kind of place people fish at during the day and ignore at night. I'd driven out there after work because I'd had one of those long, restless evenings where you don't want to sit inside, and the idea of watching the water seemed better than staring at my ceiling. It was late September, cool but not freezing yet. A thin mist was drifting off the lake, not thick enough to hide anything, just enough to soften the air. I parked near the boat launch and walked to the little clearing where the grass flattened into a rough shoreline. The lake was perfectly still. Not a ripple, not a duck, nothing. The moon was only a sliver, barely reflecting. I sat down on a half-buried log with a thermos of coffee and tried to relax. It was quiet enough that I could hear insects in the grass behind me. Every now and then a car hissed down the distant highway. Otherwise, it felt like the whole lake was holding its breath. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed the reflection. At first, I thought it was a fish rising, just a sudden bright glint under the surface. Lake Sundown isn't deep, and sometimes the right angle of the moon can make things look brighter than they really are. But this glint didn't fade. It grew sharper, almost like a line of light, a streak of brightness beneath the water. I leaned forward, squinting. The water wasn't moving. There were no waves, nothing that would distort a reflection, but the reflection itself was moving. Slowly. It slid across the lake bed like someone was dragging a flashlight under the water. It wasn't bobbing or shifting with the surface. It moved in a dead straight path, smooth and steady, like it didn't care what the water above it was doing. "There's nothing out here," I muttered to myself, as if saying it would make the reflection behave normally. I looked up at the sky, thinking maybe a helicopter or a plane was passing overhead. Nothing, just a few stars, weak through the haze. No beams, no flashes, no movement. When I looked back down, the bright streak had drifted closer, maybe 20 yards from the shore now. I didn't hear anything. No engine, no splashing, but as the light moved, the tiniest rings appeared on the surface, like vibrations too gentle to be real. They didn't spread outward the way normal ripples do. They tightened inward, almost like the surface was being pulled. I stood up. The light responded. It froze, just stopped mid-drift. I held still, heart thumping. The air felt heavier suddenly, as if something large was pushing down on the atmosphere. Even the insects behind me went quiet. The entire shoreline turned silent in a way that didn't feel natural, like sound had been switched off. I took one cautious step back from the edge. The light flickered once, bright, then dim, before holding steady again. I didn't want to turn around. I don't know why. Something in the stillness made me feel like the lake itself was watching me, waiting. I kept my eyes on the glowing streak below the surface. After a few seconds, it began to move again, but not toward me this time, sideways, tracing a slow arc. The arc tightened gradually until the reflection formed a faint curve beneath the surface. Then the curve folded in on itself, shrinking but never losing brightness. The light didn't behave like it belonged to anything physical. It wasn't scattering or refracting. It was too clean, too controlled. I didn't realize I'd stepped closer again until the toes of my boots touched wet sand. The glow jerked sharply. Not toward me, away. It darted under the water in a straight line, faster than before, like it had been startled. The movement was so smooth that the surface didn't break until the light passed beneath a shallower stretch near the reeds. Then a faint wake appeared, just one line, before vanishing completely. I held my breath and scanned the shoreline, waiting for the light to reappear. It didn't. But the lake didn't return to normal either. The mist over the water thickened, pulling closer to the surface in slow drifts that didn't match the air movement. The quiet deepened even more. I could hear my own breathing louder than the water itself. I checked my phone. 10:48 p.m. I could have sworn it had only been a few minutes since I sat down, but the thermos beside me was already cool to the touch. I took a few steps along the shore, scanning the water. My footsteps sounded too loud on the damp sand. The mist parted around me in slow curls. I kept expecting the light to appear again, maybe farther out or coming from a different direction. Nothing. Just the lake. Still. Dark. I turned back toward my car, telling myself I was overreacting, that it had been a reflection from something on the highway, or some weird underwater phenomenon. But halfway across the clearing, I felt a pressure shift in the air that made me stop mid-step. It was subtle, like the atmosphere had tightened around my ears. I looked back at the lake. The surface was glowing. Not brightly, just a faint wash of pale silver spreading across the top of the water, moving from the far end of the lake toward where I'd been standing. It wasn't moonlight. The moon was too thin, too far away, and it wasn't bright enough to cover the lake like that. The glow grew closer in slow waves, but the water didn't move with it. No ripples, no wind, just a sheet of dim light gliding across the surface like a reflection that had lost its source. I took another step backward, pulse hammering in my throat. The glow stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. A perfect, dead halt about 30 yards from the shore. I waited for something, anything, to break the silence. A frog. A bird. Even a gust of wind. But the world stayed locked in that freeze-frame stillness. Then, from directly beneath the glowing area, bubbles rose. Small ones at first, barely making a sound. Then larger ones, spaced evenly, too evenly. They rose in a vertical line as if marking a path upward. When they reached the surface, they didn't pop like normal bubbles. They slipped soundlessly into nothing. The glow dimmed, slowly, softening until the water turned dark again. The bubbles stopped, the mist settled, and the quiet eventually lifted, not all at once, but in layers. First, distant insects, then the subtle lap of water against the reeds. Finally, the faint hum of the highway. I didn't move until all of those sounds returned. When they did, I walked straight to my car, hands shaking, trying to act like everything was normal, even though my legs felt numb. I kept glancing back at the lake while I unlocked the door, half expecting the glow to return. It didn't. The drive home felt wrong, though. The darkness along the trees looked too heavy. Every reflective sign seemed brighter. My phone restarted itself once without me touching it. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a minute with the engine running, trying to slow my breathing. The world around me looked ordinary again, and that almost made it worse. Inside, I checked the time. 11:31 p.m. I'd only spent maybe an hour at the lake, but it felt like much longer. I still go back to Lake Sundown sometimes, during the day or early evening. I've never seen the glow again. I've never seen anything moving underwater that shouldn't be, but every time I stand by that shoreline, I get the same faint feeling in my chest, like something is waiting under the water, just beyond where the light can reach. And I never stay past dusk anymore. I was walking home from my friend Jonah's place when it happened. It was close to midnight, a cold early spring night in Missoula, where the air smelled like thawing earth and leftover snowmelt. I'd stayed later than I meant to, talking about nothing important, and decided to walk instead of calling a rideshare since I only lived about 15 minutes away. The streets were quiet, mostly residential, a few porch lights on, windows dark. I cut through Alder Park like I always did. It wasn't really a park, more of an elongated green strip that followed a bike path between two neighborhoods. At night, it felt isolated because the lamps along the path flickered a lot and barely covered the length of the walkway. I'd walked it 100 times without thinking about it. I was passing the little cluster of pine trees near the middle of the path when I noticed my shadow stretching strangely ahead of me. At first I thought I'd imagined it. Shadows warp all the time under dim streetlights. But when I stepped forward again, the shadow shot out far longer than it should have, maybe 20 or 30 feet, stretching way past the reach of the nearest lamp. I stopped. The shadow froze with me, but it didn't look right. The edges were too sharp, and instead of blending into the path, it looked like it extended over flat ground that wasn't there. Almost like the path had become a screen and someone was projecting my outline onto it. I turned around to see if maybe a car had pulled onto the adjacent road or if a porch light had come on. Nothing. Every house was dark. The street was empty. The usual hum of distant traffic felt softened, like someone had turned down the volume of the whole city. I faced forward again. My shadow twitched. Not much, just a quick snap shorter by a few inches, like whatever was casting it had shifted. I instinctively stepped back, and the shadow elongated even farther, stretching into a weird, distorted line that made the proportions wrong. My arms looked too long in the silhouette. My head looked too narrow. It didn't look like a real shadow anymore. I whispered, "No, no, no," under my breath and stepped sideways off the path. The shadow didn't follow me. Instead, it stayed fixed to one spot on the pavement, even though I had clearly moved out of alignment with any imaginable light source. It stretched straight toward a point in the sky above the trees, too high for a lamp, too low for a plane. That's when I felt the pressure change. The air around me thickened, not colder or warmer, just heavier. My ears popped softly, and the distant noises of the neighborhood thinned out until all I could hear was my own breathing. The street lamps flickered, but not in the usual random way. They flickered in sequence, one, then another, then the next. A faint glow appeared above the pines. Not bright, not like a spotlight. More like a patch of the sky had become less dark, a hazy disk of pale light that didn't have a source or edges. It hovered there, too still to be part of the natural night sky. As the glow held steady, my shadow snapped back, instantly, shrinking to the shape a normal shadow should have been under a nearby lamp. The sudden shift startled me so badly I stumbled backward into the grass. The glow overhead flickered once, then began to fade, slowly dimming until nothing remained but the ordinary dark sky. The moment it disappeared, all the ambient noise returned. The distant traffic, a dog barking, wind brushing the branches. The sequence of flickering lamps stopped. My ears unpopped. Everything fell back into place like a reset. I stayed crouched there in the grass, gripping the damp earth, breathing hard. I scanned the sky for anything, movement, a shape, another glow, but it was empty, completely ordinary. The pines shifted gently with the breeze. After maybe a minute, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt rubbery. I walked in a wide arc around the place where my shadow had stretched unnaturally, avoiding that spot on the path like it was a live wire. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, nearly dropping it. When I pulled it out, the lock screen was bright and normal, but the time made me stop. 12:03 a.m., 20 minutes later than I expected. The walk from Jonah's place to that part of the park shouldn't have taken more than 10 minutes, and I knew I hadn't been standing still for that long. The battery percentage had also dropped significantly, from 61% when I'd left his place to 34% now. I tried not to think about it. I put my phone away and kept walking, but every time I passed under a street lamp, I checked my shadow. It stayed normal the rest of the way home, though my heartbeat didn't settle until I was inside my apartment with the deadbolt locked. I sat at the kitchen table for a while, replaying everything. The shadow, the pressure, the glow, the silence. But what bothered me most was the timing. The reset of sound the moment the glow vanished, like its presence had pushed everything else out of alignment. Around 1 a.m., once I'd calmed down enough to think clearly, I went to the window facing the park. I expected darkness, but the lamps along the path were brighter than usual, steady, no flickering. I almost turned away when I noticed something near the base of the lamp closest to the pines. A long, narrow mark, almost a scorch but not quite, ran across the pavement in the same direction my shadow had stretched earlier. It wasn't pitch black, more like a faint discoloration, as if the ground had been warmed or compressed for a moment. I stared at it until fatigue finally overpowered me. I slept badly. When I left for work the next morning, the mark was still there, faint but unmistakable. By the time I returned that evening, it had faded almost completely. The path looked normal again. But even now, weeks later, when I walk home late, I avoid Alder Park. I stick to the longer, well-lit streets, and anytime a light behind me casts a shadow, I watch it carefully, waiting to see if it stretches farther than it should. So far, it hasn't, but sometimes when the night is very still, I feel that same pressure in the air for a split second, and I find myself checking the sky for a fading glow I hope I never see again.